obstacles. So that force could be
All right.
transferred.
So
Now I'm not
Johnson,
saying
Johnson
in
and
real life
Bogwick.
that the levator would not also be working. I'm just saying that, if you were to take somebody and cut out their levator, they would still be able to lift their shoulder, although the scapula being much more unstable, they would still be able to raise the shoulder.
Okay. And you said they didn't just say upwardly rotate, they said elevate too. Johnson and
Yes.
Bogwick found.
Yes.
Okay, let me finish. Johnson and
Okay.
Bogwick found that the angle of orientation of the upper fibers of the trapezius are unable to create any significant elevation of the scapula. The arm is in neutral. They also showed that the upper fibers need the coordinated assistance of the lower and middle fibers to upwardly rotate the scapula, highlighting they do not function in isolation. They also found that the trapezius muscle is insufficient to rotate or elevate the scapula alone. Instead, it is coupled action with the serratus anterior that does. So
I think that's our point of like contention is I think if you do a shrug, you're going to grow levator and upper traps. And I think if you do the Kelso shrug, that you would be biasing more middle traps than upper traps relative to doing the shrug. That's where our thing is I think that I think shrugs are going to do both, but I think it functions on a continuum where this is like as we go from like a vertical motion, whether it be here or here, as we start to move from here to more back, that it becomes more middle trap biased, especially like per what we found is that at about 60 degrees, it really went to where those middle trap fibers were more right. And as you start to get to more horizontal, then even the lower traps start to come in more. And then if you start going up here, then it's almost all exclusively. So it's like it's to me, it looks like it's a continuum from, more upper trap bias to more middle trap bias to more lower trap bias. And the levator is always going to be a component of anything that's elevating the scapula, as is the serratus anterior, as is the rhomboids, but the participation is going to be dependent on how much upward rotation is happening, how much retraction is happening in the respective movement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Okay. Well, then, yeah. So then I don't know where we're in disagreement then, because I mean, on that aspect, right? I don't know. We can do this like change my mind style. Pretty much sent you the points or whatever. So we can. I mean, if we want to, we can start with just you kind of doing a summary in case somebody hasn't actually watched your video, right?
I think probably since you sent the email, if you want to cover the points of contention and agreement, that would probably be easiest. I think that the biggest sense of disagreement is that you think a vertical shrug is driven by the upper traps and clavicle motion.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, essentially the motion occurs mainly at the sternoclavicular joint. Yeah.
Okay. And my source of contention is that the motion is driven at the scapula by the levator.
Okay.
Cool. So that's pretty much. So one thing I'm not going to do is like entertain a bunch of like wild theories. Like, so what we've kind of looked at is like the Johnson paper, and then we have some fine wire EMG research.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have your surface level EMG stuff that you've kind of used to try to validate your point that it's the motion is being driven by the upper trap fibers at the clavicle.
Well, I mean, that wasn't the goal was that you said that the sensor placement in all of the EMG study is, in the wrong place. And, I kind of agree with you there, and that, that we would definitely get some. So the purpose is like, all right, well, what if I place some sensors in a place where it couldn't possibly interfere with the levator or the middle trap? So I went with like a, lateral anterior portion on the trap sensor placement, and then, a bunch of other ones. So I could see what would happen if we did that.
That's still pretty much an impossibility, which is easily disputed by the fine wire EMG stuff, which we can get into.
Okay. Yeah. We can get into into that, and your critiques of what we did. Yeah, that'd be great. Um, so I mean, I just don't want to misquote you or whatever, right? So as we're going through this, um, so we have the points that I think we agree on probably are that I put in the email here is that the upper fibers of the upper trap likely have the less hypertrophy potential. And I mean, you can take the fascicle number and fascicle size as evidence for that. But there's also a really good study actually from this year that looked at, the actual muscle volume of the different divisions from infant to adult. And you can see that, in infants, you have a significantly larger percentage of upper trap volume. And then as you mature as an adult, it starts to shift disproportionately to the lower. So, so there's several reasons, but if we're, I think if people are thinking of this as like, it's like, the fibers that come up and attach to your neck, I think we can both agree that you're not going to get like, your neck's not going to like take a horizontal line out, like Captain Synthol or whatnot. Like there's limited hypertrophy potential in those, and there's more hypertrophy potential the lower, or I should say the more you go towards the middle section of the trap from either direction, right? Because there's less potential in the lower trap and the most upper trap. So in terms of just how big something can get. So is that fair?
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
Right. And the other thing I think we're in agreement on this. I mean, we've been going back and forth on social media, is that in terms of total muscle volume, per the Johnson study, the middle traps were the largest muscle volume in terms of comparing the upper trap and the middle trap. And just while we're at this, we'll just qualify. Is it safe to say we can qualify upper trap as everything from C6 up and middle trap as C7 to T1, right?
Yep.
So, okay.
Yeah, I
Um,
was going to say that it's important to make a distinction of because the majority of the research consistently misquotes upper traps as at the C7, which is clearly mid traps.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. Because the description in a lot of the EMG stuff is 50% the line between C7 and the acromion, right on there. And I don't know if they're doing that out of convenience, just because if they're not using ultrasound or whatnot, it can be hard to palpate where the C6 is. So if that was just something born out of convenience and then they just kept going with it,
I
or why they would
think
choose to
that
do that.
when you look at and I think I sent you the link for the one, there's the documentation for doing placement, sensor placement, and then they consistently just have it mislabeled. So they always put C7 there and then just qualify it as mid traps. And that's just something that's never been really corrected over the course of decades. So there's actually a study that documented how often sensor placement is wrong for C7, qualifying it as mid traps when it's clearly not mid traps. And that, again, that is what's caused a huge amount of misinterpretation of the data throughout the decades is placing sensors at C7 and then defining it as upper trap activation.
Mm-hmm. And you're referring to the Zanka study,
There's
I,
a
I
there's a
believe.
bunch or there was the Zanka the one where they actually looked at the studies where they said it was there's studies showing there's one study I don't remember who did the study that shows that basically talks about all of the studies where the placement is wrong.
Yeah. When you posted that comment online, you referenced the Zanka study, right? And so,
It may have been Zanka.
yeah. So I went and I got that paper, and they cover that especially in their introduction and whatnot. But the conclusion that they came up with was that to still use at the end of that thing was to still use the traditional sensor placement. And I
And
read Sue's, I
I
read.
don't, again, I don't know if there is actually something that goes on in research that makes it more difficult to do C6 placement in relation to C7, or if they're just taking a hit on the fact that it's just not correct. But it's not like C7 placement's not upper traps.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you there. And what they did essentially in that Zanka study is they addressed that, and then they decided to place they did three sensor placements. They did one, very clavicle, and then they did a higher one. And then they ran a bunch of fucking, experiments and whatnot. Not experiments is the right way, but they did a bunch of positions or whatnot to try and standardize that or whatever, right? And
Right.
essentially, their conclusion was is that they thought that the C7 sensor placement was better or gave better data still. Like, and I agree with you. Is like I don't think that's a good way of doing that because I don't like okay, just because you're getting better signal doesn't necessarily mean that's there. But essentially, the one thing for our discussion that we can take away with is that there's a pretty strong correlation between upper trap and middle trap involvement, meaning that they tend to be working at the same time in most of these upper motions. Like there isn't like, in all of the motions that they were doing, there tend to be similar engagement between the C7 sensor and the others. So I don't know really what to make of that. We can, I mean, if you want to, we can just keep going with the EMG stuff before we jump into the Johnson stuff. Because the question I would have for you, Paul, is that if all of the data that we have on upper traps is really middle traps when in regards to EMG, then what data do we actually have on upper traps in terms of EMG? Is it just none?
Actually, I look, we don't have good data from an EMG standpoint. And I think it is important to understand that going back to like the way that you did it and other people did it in surface level EMG, we are going to get crosstalk, significant crosstalk at those C6 positions from the levator. I mean, when you look at the fine wire EMG from the what's the study that I referenced?
The
Um,
Castellan study from
yeah, Kassem study.
2015.
So
Yep.
the Kassem study is like and there's a multitude. I mean, I could have brought all these up, but there's a multitude where they've actually done surface level comparison to fine wire, and they look and the amount of crosstalk that happens between specific muscles is very, very significant. Sometimes there's not a lot in some muscles, and it's very,
Mhm.
but when you get past superficial stuff into deep muscles, it can be incredibly different. So I think that when the reason why the Castellan study is important is because it shows in basically an anatomical position of a vertical shrug, the levator basically was the highest of all. And we're eliminating crosstalk and looking at, we're not just the other thing, the problem that we have with the surface level EMG is that we're just looking at action potentials. We're not necessarily looking at real activation. Whereas we get a better picture of fine wire with real activation of those fibers. And in the Castellan study, what we see is high degrees of activation out of the levator scapula. And then they use a C7 placement as usual. And then after that, it's high degrees of mid traps. So if you take that picture, which is a pretty accurate representation of what we see with the Johnson study, then I don't feel like it's hard to understand that a vertical shrug is a scapular driven motion by the levator. And then we have a certain amount of force coupling that's going to be going on between upper, mid, and serratus anterior. So I think trying to define it as a clavicle motion, there's no place in the Johnson study where they came to that conclusion and basically said overall, they couldn't conclude that the traps, any of the divisions of the traps, are shoulder elevators.
Okay. I want to save my disagreements with what you said there about the Johnson study until we wrap up the EMG stuff here. So with the Castellan study, what you're saying is there's no like they did no upper trap reading,
I didn't know
right?
that's straw manning. I didn't say there's no upper trap. I said they measured at C7, which is mid traps.
So then let me ask you then, did they measure upper traps at all in that study
No,
then?
their placement is C7.
Okay. So then can we say that they didn't measure the upper traps in the Castellan
Right. They
study?
didn't
Okay.
measure the upper traps.
Okay. So all right. So they measured the middle traps. So they basically would have measured like the highest portion of the middle traps, and then they don't. That's the one paper I haven't been able to get. I asked you for a copy, but I didn't get one, so I don't know if you know
It's right. It's
where
not. You don't even have to buy it. Just Google it.
I I all I could find was the abstract, and there was no link to purchase it
No,
anywhere. So all right.
I'm literally looking at it right now.
Well, then send me a copy like I asked for. Um,
Um,
but
it's
it
literally
did
yeah
they
the
so do they
cop
describe where they the where they're act where sensor that they actually labeled as middle trap, where that was?
Yeah, yeah, it's right there.
Because I'm curious if that was if they had two middle trap sensors and one was lower and one was higher,
Yeah, do you want
so
me to
that we
read it
could at
off to
least
you? I
because
can
what
read it off
I
to you.
because if those were both middle trap, what I would like to know is if what they were reporting is just that the highest fibers of the middle trap were more active than the lowest fibers of the middle trap, or if their middle
So
trap
yeah,
sensor was a lower trap measurement.
um, yeah. So a reference electrode was placed over this spinous process of the C7 vertebrae, and I think what they end up doing, if and I'll have to go back here and look, but I want to say I'll have to go and look, but their upper that was the upper part of the mid trap measurement.
Yeah, I want to know what the actual middle trap sensor that they used. I want to know where that was in comparison to that, because that would be useful.
I had that.
Because it would be useful to know for our purposes of look how we're looking at this is if if they were seeing a higher activation in the C7 fibers than the T1 fibers as they went to a more vertical motion, and they were seeing a higher amount of T1 fibers as they were going to more or less of a vertical
Well,
motion.
what they're defining, okay, so then what they're defining, because I'm looking right at the study, what they're defining in basically a vertical shrug, the majority of the activity is occurring in the levator scapular. And then after that, it's the what they call upper trapezius. And then from there, it pretty much drops off. Well, actually, rhomboid's pretty close. Rhomboid major is pretty close. And then from there, what they're defining on here, and I'd have to look at the placement, but middle trap is basically almost nothing.
Yeah, which I
And I'm
mean, we would
guessing their
expect that.
quote unquote middle trap placement is probably going to be lower. I'm pretty sure it's lower.
Yeah, that's what I want to know, right? Because I mean, because it would be helpful to know if we have, this fine wire EMG that's showing that, there's a difference in the middle trap, or if we're really looking at two lower traps and one middle trap sensor,
Well,
right?
the one is clearly mid traps.
So,
That one is clearly mid trap. So if you look at the activation level, they basically, I think they have two sensor placements for lower traps. I think that's what they have, and they're calling. I think they have one for mid or two for mid traps, one for lower, and then they're calling the upper. They're calling the upper trap, the mid trap, an upper trap, and then the second is I think the lower part of the upper traps, and then the lower traps. But
yeah,
I think that's how they did the placement because what they call upper traps is mid traps, and then they have um a middle trap and a lower trap placement. I think what's happened is potentially they're two the middle trap and lower trap are just lower trap placements. I think that's probably
that's
because the drop that's what makes sense because the activation in those is basically nothing.
Yeah, that would be my guess, because that's if you go by that, that would be very similar to what we found in our poor little surface EMG study, would be exactly what they found in the fine wire there in terms of the relationship between the middle and lower traps, right? During these type of motions, right?
Yeah, and
Right.
I think the difference there is when you're getting into fine wire because we can go to those deeper muscles is that we see high degrees of activation higher than anything else in the levator and then so it's levator, mid traps, and rhomboids. That's what we're
Okay.
looking at. And
Now, you and I are probably, I mean, I don't know. I thought we were on the same page in terms of interpreting EMG. So when I look at this, I don't immediately be like the one of these was the highest, that therefore makes that the muscle that is biased this thing, because so when I'm looking at this, I only compare, say, like the levator to the levator across the different exercises. And yes, it was highest in the regular shrug versus the overhead shrug versus, the retracted shrug or whatever, which I would expect because the regular shrug that they did here would be the one with the most downward rotation of the scapula. So, that would make sense.
right, and then overhead shrug, the levator would be put on slack. So
Yeah,
it would
because
be
you have to be in more upward rotation, right?
yeah, right.
Yeah. But I didn't but I don't extrapolate that of these, I would say, okay, of these, the regular shrug was the most levator biased of these, but it was also the most middle trap or upper trap is labeled here, but
Middle,
what
middle is
we're
middle,
calling middle.
middle,
Yeah,
middle.
mupper trap, whatever the heck we want to call, like.
It's the
So C7, the C7 sensor also was the most biased in the shrug, right? And so when we look at those, we're saying, well, like which one of these in this scenario, the way that I interpreted this is I wouldn't say, well, this one because it's simply a higher EMG rating is more than that one. I would say of these three exercises, both of these were biased in the shrug over the other two, and that's really the extent of what we could extrapolate from that data, right?
But
Um,
we've had plenty of conversations where you have nuanced bias to very, very small degrees.
Nuance bias, right? I mean,
Well,
yeah. I mean,
everything
so
from
so
when we look at longitudinal hypertrophy studies, to whether you're looking at long head or short head, like biceps or whatever, you'll be like, well, it's a little more, so that's bias. We've had arguments about like, well, what does bias mean? But wouldn't
yeah,
in this particular study, it's significant. It's not like a small amount. It's fairly significant. It's you're looking at 44 to 33. So I mean, the levator is significantly more active. And again, in fine wire, we're looking at legitimate activation of the fibers. We're not looking at action potentials that are, you know, traveling across the sarcolemma or whatever. We're looking at actual like fiber activation with fine wire. That's the difference. And then we're eliminating some crosstalk. So in this particular study, which is why this is a really good study to look at for a vertical shrug, what is really driving that motion? What the nervous system is having to create more motor units to drive that motion for is at the levator scapula. So do you not agree with that?
I agree that of the three exercises, the levator scapula is working proportionately more in the shrug, right? But I also agree of the three exercises, the middle, the C7 sensor was also working proportionally the most in the shrug, right? You know, because let's
Yep.
say, I mean, because if we take an exercise like, you know, if we take elbow flexion, just to use something that's extremely simple that people can relate to, right? And we're like, okay, if I'm doing elbow flexion and I'm measuring all the elbow flexors, you know, I'm fine wiring into the, you know, the brachialis and whatnot, and you know, and I'm measuring all those things, right? You know, and then I could be like, all right, well, if I do elbow flexion and then I do like, you know, whatever, I do something that's not related, I do a fly or a lateral raise or something or whatnot, I'm going to get that, you know, the elbow flexors are the most active in the curl over all of those other exercises. But in that instance, that doesn't tell me the best curl for the different elbow flexors. It just tells me, but one of those elbow flexors is naturally going to be higher and lower. So in this instance, you know, all I'm saying is that it's I would say it's accurate to say that the levator scapulae was most biased in the shrug over the other exercises, but also the C7 was also the most biased in the shrug over the exercises. But I wouldn't qualify this as me being able to say, hey, this is a C7 versus this is a levator scapulae exercise. I would say, well, the shrug seems to be based off of EMG good for both. So then the next thing that I would look at would be the other aspects of like, okay, let's look at the, you know, the range of motion, the mechanics. We can get into the stuff in the Johnson study or whatever to fill in that gap, because you can only extrapolate so much from EMG data because it doesn't give you muscle length. It doesn't give you range of motion. It doesn't give you, you know, a lot of that stuff. And keep in mind that these are percentage of MVIC. So depending on what they use for how they standardize whatever the 100% is, can shift the bias of these things, right? Because it changes the scale for the different muscles. So if they measure this in, you know, a position that was more advantageous to middle trap and less to levator, then the levator has a bigger margin to grow in that, you know, based off of that MVIC. So that's why I really only like comparing muscle to muscle. So for example, when we're doing our stuff, you know, I'm not most of the time what I'm looking for is if I'm comparing exercises, it's like which exercises make that muscle go up relative to itself rather than relative towards other things. Because while traditionally that's been used, you know, in terms of interpreting EMG, I think that's a very weak way of using a proxy. I think the best you can do is you compare a muscle to itself in similar, we'll say similar ranges of motion, and that's where EMG can be the most useful. So what I'm saying from this is levator active definitely during the shrug, the C7 definitely more active during the shrug over the other things, right? So but if we're looking at this as just like vertical
You mean
motions
the
and
C7? You mean the C7? The mid traps were more active in the shrug than comparatively to the overhead shrugs or retraction shrugs.
Yes. Yes. Right.
Yes.
So because basically, I mean, when we're looking at anything that's comparing different exercises, we only have it comparing those exact exercises, right? So that's the context that I'm looking in here, right? And I mean, are we on the same page there? I mean, maybe you think that when you're looking at this data, this suggests that the levator scapula is more biased than the middle traps, and I would just say I think this just says that they are both biased in the shrug over the other two exercises.
I'm gonna stick with the fact I think that the reason why the levator shows up significantly more is because the nervous system is activating more motor units for the levator because it's what's driving the motion.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's fine. We can share a
Okay.
slightly similar, but also slightly
I
different
if
interpretation there.
it was if the EMG again, this is fine wire, so we're eliminating crosstalk and we're looking at real activation. And
Yeah.
in a vertical
Well,
shrug, it's significantly more levator. It's not like
yeah.
even slightly biased. It's significantly more.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's only fine wire for the levator and the rhomboid, right? The traps are still
No,
surface EMG.
right,
Pretty sure.
right.
Yep.
But and
So
then when you look at and then when you do comparison across some other the surface level, because I've already done this, of course, it's there and all of the other C7s. You're looking at again like high. It basically beats out the other stuff that they end up measuring. So like the mid traps are always are going to be pretty dominant. So in a vertical shrug. So I think we had to like if we want to find a common ground, agree on is that the mid traps are going to be very highly involved in a vertical shrug.
yeah, I agree there that the middle traps are definitely involved in vertical shrugging, and I think the levator is definitely also involved in vertical shrugging. But I think it's important to note that they only did fine wire in the deep muscles, and they used the same technology that we did for
Well, that's because
measuring the
there's only you
trapezius.
can't. Well, you have to. Yeah, there's no. That's because you have to use fine wire for the deep muscle, right? There's no
Yes,
other way to
yeah.
get to those.
So my question
So
would be is if like because I would with the surface level EMG stuff or it's just surface EMG surface level kind of has a negative connotation to it. Um,
I
is
think the only surface level only has a negative connotation in the sense that if we're trying to separate out legitimate, first off, number one, as we like I already covered, is that there's some shortcomings with it in terms of actual activation rather than action potential. So those are two very different things. And then the other thing is like the crosstalk and the differentiation that goes on between the deep muscles and the surface level muscles that they can measure. So it can't differentiate the crosstalk. Everybody understands that crosstalk is a problem with
mhm,
surface level EMG. Like there's no getting around that. That's again
yeah.
why we use fine wire for the deep muscle so we can separate that out, and why you can still use a surface level for the mid traps, like in this particular situation, but then we have to use a fine wire. But to separate those out, at least in some way, to give us a distinction of what's going on from a
Mhm.
legitimate activation standpoint is very helpful.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it just seemed that, I mean, because I'm using the same technology that these guys are for, because surface level, especially like, for muscles where you don't have something that is in that area, like, because you need fine wire to measure deep muscles, right? And fine wire is
Mhm.
even better for superficial muscles where you basically don't have enough area to space out your
Yeah, for anything
your
small,
surface things,
yes.
right? So
Yep.
the areas where they've shown that like okay fine wire might be superior is like when they're looking at like the plantar muscles and stuff where you have everything crossing over
Yeah.
itself in the bottom of the
Anything like in
foot
a
and things like
gait.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Any
you
like
know
plantar flexion, that's one of the ones that you end up
mhm,
seeing a pretty significant difference
mhm.
in
Yeah.
with surface level to fine wire is that you end up, it's not, it's only like what is it? I'm trying to remember there's a plantar flexor in there, and it's a pretty significant difference when you go from fine
Mhm.
wire to surface level
Yep.
that separates that out.
Yep.
So I agree they can both be used. It's just that understanding the application of them being used is also important to know. So like we're testing something like quads and we're just looking like at the vasti muscles or
Mhm.
stuff like that. Like I mean, surface level is fine. Once we start, if we want to look at, and you know this from like your own stuff, if we want to look at something like a piriformis or a glumedius or whatever, like, well, you're kind of SOL.
Yeah.
So
So when you're
yeah,
being critical of me measuring the traps because I'm using surface EMG, right? Like, and that's what I mean, are you being overly critical of me just, just to take a dig at me, or do you see that would be a problem with this data as well?
Yeah, I think that not having fine wire is a problem with the data because again, if my and what I have like believed for a while is that if the action is being driven at the scapula, which that's what pretty much everyone at the consensus is agree on, is the action being driven at the scapula, then what is really predominantly driving, what's the prime mover for that action? And I think it's levator scapula, which it's called the levator scapula. It elevates the
Hmm.
scapula, and that's the motion, right? Like they named it that a long time ago for a specific reason.
Yes.
So it's not about it's the quote unquote dig is about the fact that it's not like you can slap some surface level EMG on stuff and get some readings, but again, can we account for crosstalk? Can we account for deep muscle activation? No, we can't do those things, and that's in this kind of discussion that is critically important because there's muscles like the rhomboids, like the levator scapula, that you're just not really going to be able to get a good reading off of. And then we're going to be looking at a significant degree of crosstalk that's going to be happening on those surface level muscles that you're going to be measuring. So without some degree to be able to extrapolate those out separate from one another, then we don't know exactly what we're looking at. Would it be have been far more helpful in a study like this? Like the end, this study could have ended any of the discussions if they would have done something like a C6 to C7, like activation in terms of looking at that plus the levator rhomboids and all that kind of stuff. But again, one of the consistent problems that we deal with, and it's not just trap studies, but is sensor placement. And I think that you and I both have even looked at a multitude of glute studies where we have all sorts of placement on the glutes where people can't differentiate out between the superior and the lower fibers of the glutes and have wrong sensor placement on those as well. So this is a problem across like lots of these are have issues in terms of methodology.
Yeah, there's definitely, yeah, there's no lower glutes measured in any of the published research that I was able to uh
Right.
obtain from. um
But
okay.
that would have been the thing that would have ended any of that, a lot of that hip flex, abduction stuff, slap even a surface level EMG
Hmm.
on the lower glute fibers, they're just not going to show up.
Hmm.
So that I mean that kind of I mean that ends that discussion, that particular discussion altogether. So place sensor placement is a big issue. And again, the other issue is understanding just the difference between action potentials and legitimate activation that's going on at the fiber level. So those are just some, yes, some nuances that make a difference there. So I think that like I said, my stance is that it's a scapular driven motion that's elevation, and that's being driven by mainly by the levator scapula. And again, I think from the Johnson study, if you want to get into that now, clearly defines that from a anatomical position, especially the upper traps, but I guess the traps in general don't have the ability to elevate the shoulder.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Let me say one more thing, and then we'll move on to the Johnson study. Just or I'll ask you one more question here on the EMG stuff, and just kind of summarize, because I compiled as much of the whatever the EMG studies that are out there, right? And like we said, the sensor placement is probably wrong, but the trend tends to be that, like, so and this one where they compared, I think it's like 12 different exercises, right? They did a ratio of middle to upper trap, right? Which probably was, I don't know, maybe it's middle trap to middle trap, maybe it's middle trap to lower trap, you know, I don't know. But essentially, the higher sensor was more dominant in the vertical motion that they had, which in this case, the most vertical they had was a shoulder press. They didn't do an actual shrug, but a rowing motion was the most, lower or
Mid
middle
trap,
sensor
I
dominant,
would
right?
imagine a row. I would
Yep.
imagine a row. Yeah, would be a lot
Yeah.
more.
Right. And then this other one that they did, like, I don't know, like 26 exercises or something like that. It was kind of a mock meta-analysis of everything that they could find on in terms of um exercises or whatever, and they found that the most middle trap biased in relationship to upper trap was an isometric row, and the most upper to middle trap was shrug overhead. So in that instance, again, like, this is them looking at all of this stuff, and so we're assuming that this data is dirty because of sensor placement. But I'd say the one trend is that, all right, well, the higher sensor placement does seem to be more dominant in the vertical motions
I would
and
I
the.
would expect I would totally expect that to happen because of the fact that despite the fact that there's no osseous connections between C6 and C7, that's another thing we didn't really cover. It's like the C6 to C7, those are completely separate divisions. There's no
Mhm.
connection there between the upper and the mid traps. But despite the fact, like I've talked about with crosstalk, if you have a very high sensor placement, you're still going to get, I would suspect that you would get way more activation because of the fact that you are going to have upper trap activation and you're going to have mid trap activation. So it's potentially picking up both of those. And then
Mhm.
if you have levator, it would be picking up that too. So again, this comes back to sensor placement can create. I would agree with you that anytime we start looking at sensor placement on the C7, it's probably going to be the highest there because you're going to have a lot of mid trap activation. There will be some upper trap activation, and then there's potential for the crosstalk Vader. So I think there's always going to be more there.
Okay. So do you think in the Castellan study that the trap data that they have that we're looking at a C7, do you think that those numbers are actually good, knowing that they are surface EMG and not fine wire EMG?
Yeah, I think again, if we're looking at action at even at surface level EMG, I think we just have to have something that differentiates out what's going on at the deep muscles. Like,
Okay. All right.
can we have to, and that's what I said this whole time. We just need something that contrasts that. So do
Mhm.
we
All right.
see low degrees of activation that's going on in deep muscles, or do we see high degrees of activation when that's going on in deep muscles? No different than what would be a study with looking at, like, since we had all those arguments for months and months, not you and I, but about like the seated abduction machine, right? Like it would be far more advantageous for us to know, despite the fact that we have some pretty good data on the moments that are happening, that it would be far more advantageous for us to have some fine wire looking at piriformis, looking at glute medius, and looking at the superior fibers of the glute max, and be able to compare all of those and contrast those at various joint angle ranges of motion and joint axes to see what's actually going on both at the surface level and deep muscle level. So I think we just need the contrast to show that what's going on in the Castellan studies, like the pretty much the only one that we have that looks at that. So until we have more research that's looking at those and contrasting those, that's what we have to go on right
Okay, so let me like, because you brought up the glute thing, let me ask you this, because again, so it sounds like you really want to see us being able to measure all of the muscles and then comparing them different muscles to each other, which I agree that's beneficial information. But in terms of like when I'm looking at what is a good exercise for this thing, I actually think I only need the data for that thing. So if we look at the glutes, for example, and we did like the lower glutes and we did transverse abduction and we measured the lower glutes and they did almost nothing. And then we did hip extension and they did a lot. And then we did hip extension. And so I have all these different exercises and I can just compare the lower glutes to the lower glutes across all of those exercises
now.
and
Right.
see, okay, which exercises were the lower glutes seemingly the most active. To me, it's like, well, that's actually a useful data because it doesn't, like, if something else was also active would not change the fact that this exercise was the most active also for the lower glutes.
But if something else was far more active, you wouldn't call the lower glutes the prime mover, the more dominant muscle driving that motion.
Well, it depends on what you call prime mover because you could have a small muscle that has a higher EMG but is producing less force, right? So it's like, well,
Right.
how are you, what are you calling primary? Is it the muscle that's just
So
producing the most force or the muscle getting the
but
most stimulus?
wouldn't that also apply to your same argument that since two that you've made that if it's a small muscle with a high degree of activation, for example, the piriformis, I would expect to see
Hmm.
high degrees of activation
Hmm.
and seated abduction
Yep.
because it has the best line of pull. And then second, with the upper traps, which again, we're going to get into it. Johnson directly quotes this that they're small and not capable of producing high degrees of force, which is why they also don't have a high degree of potential for hypertrophy, would not be driving that motion. So I think that collectively, yes, you have to look at all of these things collectively and say, am I dealing with a small muscle that's doing a lot of activity given its role in this exercise? And what is the function of that activity?
Hmm.
And I think that you have to look at that and apply the context of that also to what the motion is going on. So it's never like a singular argument, right? Like we can't, there's no like one, there's not one EMG study that's ever just going to silence like everything, because yes, you have to take all of these things into consideration. Because I would expect, and this is just my theory, and I think you probably do have the same theory because there are things we do agree on, is that in a seated abduction machine, I think the piriformis would be off the charts in terms of activation. I still
Yes.
think that, yeah, I think that it would be like way off the charts in terms of activation. And I still think that it's driving a significant portion of that motion, but I think it's just a junk exercise in terms of there's a lot of stuff going on there. So that's
Hmm.
why we don't get to like bias off any one division more so than the other. And I think that in the case of like a vertical shrug, I think the difference is that when we look at the data from like collectively across both of these studies, which is why I think that it comes back to it makes sense that the levator scapula is driving this motion.
Okay.
So
So
I think what you're kind of saying is that is but just because a muscle is highly active in an exercise, does it mean it's the prime mover? No. Like we'd have to look at everything from like what has the actual leverage at that joint range of
mhm.
motion in comparison to and often that's a really great often a great way to look at studies to determine what's like truly the prime movers. Like if we know the leverage at certain joint ranges of motion and it's showing up as the most highly active, then we can take a pretty good shot at that point and say, okay, this is what muscle is truly driving that particular motion, right?
Mhm.
So, or the traps, the one unfortunate part about them is they don't really have measurable in like moment arms, right? Like
What? Why not?
they mainly function in a their main function is going to be in the stabilization of the scapula as it moves about the thoracic wall. So like there's not like do you have a study that looks at the internal moment arms of the traps?
Well, I mean, you have the model from the Johnson study that lays it right out for the C6, right? Which
Right.
it we'll get into, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's
So
it's yeah, it's not when you look at that, and we can get into that. Yeah, you don't really end up with these significant moment arms because there's so much coordination that's going on between all of those muscles on both sides of the joint.
yeah,
So, um,
we can look at it, but
so
I would
what is
disagree. I
like?
would
Is
actually say
there
the trend.
say what?
I would disagree. I'd actually say that especially according to the Johnson study, that the traps have pretty significant moment arm relative to what they're doing. Well, we'll get into that. So
Okay.
recapping EMG, right? So the body of data just doesn't seem to consist of, we don't have any confident data in terms of upper traps, right? Because of sensor placement, right? The only trend that I see is that like, all right, higher sensor placement seems to be more biased in vertical motions, and lower like middle sensor placement seems to be more biased in retraction or rowing type motions. We only have the one fine wire thing here where it says that the levator is also pretty active. I found one other levator one, but it was all on retraction exercises. They didn't do. I think they did retraction exercises in different degrees of elevation, but there was no resistance in the vertical plane. It was all, it was all transverse stuff or
Once
whatever.
you start to
Right.
load the joint, everything changes.
Yeah, right. So it's like I don't really think we can take that. But that was the only other one that I found that had the levator and the traps in there, right? And and I know your feelings about what we did or whatnot, but like so when I'm looking at, what we looked at is just trying to really say, okay, well, let's see what would happen if we could get upper trap.
You keep saying that, and I think I've explained that pretty well. Is that I said you have, in my opinion, when you're dealing with deep muscles and superficial muscles, and you're looking at these motions, you need to
Hmm.
be able to separate those two things. And when you're just using surface level EMG, then you can't have this discussion, this argument just using surface level EMG. It's not that I'm like poo-pooing all over like the stuff that you guys do. I'm saying I don't think it's an appropriate way to look at this if we're going to be discussing how much the deep muscle is involved. Like we even get into the rhomboids, like clearly the rhomboids are significantly involved as well. So like there's like I said, it's not about poop going all over your stuff. It's about, hey, are you able to go into with what you have to work with and able to get an accurate representation of what's going on from an activation standpoint. And no, I mean, you can't. Like, you definitely have to be able to look at the deep muscles and their actions that are going on in here comparatively to superficial muscles.
To have an entire picture, yes, but to see, if I'm just looking at the upper traps and I'm just trying to see, hey,
And if you would have
what
said
is
like an
more
upper
upper
trap when you're still,
traps, right? Like if I have the upper traps and I say, well, the upper traps are more active in this than this, comparing them to themselves, then I have that data that going from this motion to this motion, the upper traps are being recruited more, right? Like
yeah, and I would
I don't
expect, I would,
need the levator data to be able to show that, right? I don't have the ability to
you,
compare
if,
the ratio of upper trap to levator, but I do have the ability to say, well, the upper trap is working more in this motion than in this motion, proportionate to itself, right?
right. But then when you look at the other study where it does look at the levator involvement and you see the contrast across those different motions, it does change the picture. So if we're going to use EMG activation as a standard, then we still have to standardize it across what we're looking at. So if we're going to say there's more upper trap, mid trap, however you're going to do the sensor placement, and then levator, rhomboid, etc., and we're using these motions, then according to activation, whether we're looking at surface level or we're looking fine wire the deep muscles, that's still the context of what we're looking at in those motions. So in those motions, what we see is from just basically an anatomical position, we have a lot of levator activation, and then we have less mid trap, and then we have a little bit less rhomboid, and we have basically what looks to be like no lower trap activation. And then there's a flip flop as you go into higher degrees of humeral elevation, and the scapula has to rotate upwards. So that to me is still like, hey, that's the data that we have to look at. So if you slap an EMG on the C6, the surface level EMG on C6, or you go to the highest degrees of elevation on the upper traps and compare it to C7, yeah, I think that you're going to see activation, high degrees of activation, because of the fact that the upper traps still have to medially rotate the clavicle. Like they're going to do something, but are they the ones driving the entire motion? No.
Okay, so when it comes to, I mean, we're talking about this mainly in the
Unless
context of
like that's what,
hypertrophy, right?
because you can't keep flip-flopping back and forth and say on one hand, okay, like activation doesn't matter, and then say, well, I think that the shrug is a clavicle motion because when I slap some EMG surface level sensors on the upper traps, they measured out real high. I'm like, well, which one are we going to do? Like you
Well,
can't flip-flop it back and forth just to fit your argument. Because
so
if the levator is higher when you're comparing a surface level to a fine wire, and you look at across exercises, okay, and then you say, well, I slapped some surface level EMG on the upper, and they registered out higher, so it's a clavicle. I'm like, well, did you measure the levator? And you're like, no, I can't. I'm like, well, then that's kind of important because that's the contention in the argument, is it not?
let me see if I can clarify this for you, right? Okay. So EMG matters, but what I'm
Right,
saying is it matters more in comparing the muscle to itself across exercises than comparing muscles to other muscles. So it matters more to me looking at all of the exercises of looking at the traps, right? And saying, okay, the traps compared to the traps, where was the traps the highest? The levator compared to the levator across all the exercises, where was the levator the highest? Right?
right.
In relations to itself,
I think
not where was
I
the
think they
so
both matter.
it does, but in different senses. So because if we had the data on every single exercise in the world, right? And then you're just like, well, okay, well, in this exercise here, this was clearly the highest activation percentage for the upper trap, right? And but you would be like, oh, but this other muscle also worked too. That wouldn't take away from the fact that this seemed to be where the highest recruitment of upper trap was, right? So it wouldn't take away from the fact that the upper trap is very strongly active there, just like it wouldn't do the reciprocal and take away that the levator was very strongly active there, right? So because there's a huge limitation in comparing across muscles using EMG, right? Because the different muscles can be going through different ranges. They can have different mechanical relationships. There's loading problems. You have the MVIC standardization that can be unequal between those. So the best thing that we have is to be able to compare the muscle to itself. That's the most useful aspect of it. I do believe comparing the muscles across each other is good, but what I tend to do then is I tend to look at the trend. So if I have if I have these exercises and I say, well, of all the available exercises, this one compared to itself was the most dominant for this muscle, but for muscle B, it was still active here, but that wasn't the most active exercise for it. It was over here. I'd be like, okay, well, if I was using EMG as the proxy there, I would say, well, it seems like it favors this exercise where it
I
is the
think,
highest
I
compared to
think,
itself.
no, I think that they all matter. And the reason why is because as you take the joint through different joint ranges of motion, that's when you actually see what it is you just talked about there. Is you're going to see an elevation and a decrease in some joint ranges of motion where something's going to be far more active and then something's going to drop off. And that's what we see cross measuring these exercises. So they're both important. I
They are.
understand your point where
I
you're
just
like,
think
where am I getting more? Hold on, I'll let you talk. Where are you getting more mid trap in these comparative exercises? Absolutely. But then where is it when we change joint angle ranges of motion, or where do we change joint articulation to where does something increase? Where does something drop off? And then in comparison, can just because, as we've covered, just because something has high degrees of activation, that doesn't always necessarily mean, for example, that it's actually driving that movement, because we always see high degrees of activation stuff that's having coordinate, say co-contractions and things like that will increase high degrees of activation from the simple fact that it's having to stabilize those joints through the joint range of motion. So there's a lot to take into context here. I think that it all matters. I think, yes, you can look and say, okay, where am I getting more trap activation? And you and I, like I said, there's activation has to have context too. So where am I getting more traps than this comparatively across these exercises? And then where am I getting more of this and that? And is there a flip flop between muscles that are driving these joint articulations between those exercises?
yeah,
I think it all matters and you have to look at it collectively.
yeah, yeah. I say it all matters. I just think the most important information that, or the most, we'll say, accurate and confidence is the information I have comparing a muscle to itself across a similar range of motion. Right. Like to me, that's where it's like, okay, I could be the most confident that this EMG is giving me practical data that is useful to extrapolating to exercise. Where
Yes, I think
everything,
I think you can use that too. And like I said, I think collectively can also, if you understand if something is dropping off, what else is picking up in those
mhm,
ranges,
yeah,
right? So I think that's why I think that it all collectively that it does matter, because we want to have the whole picture of what's going on there, right? So if
mhm,
something is, if we have high degrees of stabilization that's going on, because something is having to pick up to help stabilize that joint or do force coupling or whatever it is we have going on, then the more stabilization that we have to have internally in that range of motion, then even if something else, a prime mover, is still driving that motion, and you should know this because it's based off one of your theories, is that there's going to be less motor unit recruitment to the target tissue in those particular regions of that range of motion because of the fact that there's a higher degree of stability required at the joint.
mhm.
So all of these things have to be looked at collectively. And I agree with you. Like you can take the one part and say we have more traps in this exercise, and we see traps start to drop off through these particular,
Mhm.
basically whatever motions, right? And then in those motions where traps are dropping off, what is it that we have that's picking up that's moving? So it's like in the overhead, right? If you're looking at those overhead shrugs, like we see something very different happening. For example, with the levator, like it
Mhm.
just drops right off because it's basically in what we'd consider active
Mhm.
insufficiency right there. It's not
Yes.
capable of providing significant degrees
Mhm.
of force.
Yes. So if you were to say if you were to say that uh, an upper, like an overhead shrug, is more trapped bias in relationship to levator, I would say
Yeah,
yes, absolutely we agree,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But then the regular shrug, I'd say, well, it is more. Now there is more levator recruitment relative to the trap compared to the overhead
And
shrug.
I would say
But
in that particular, in the context of that discussion, it's because the levator is driving that motion.
yeah, well, what I would say is that based off of looking at the trend of activation, it doesn't to me say that necessarily that the traps are working less as much as it says the levator is working more. And I think that when we look at the way these things couple, especially with the model in the Johnson study, that should be evident. Is that it's that it wouldn't be that, well, okay, that the traps are not going to be producing mechanical tension now here, or getting stimulus. That it's going to be the levator
But
also to come along for the ride.
even when you compare something like an overhead shrug, the upper traps drop off too.
So the upper traps drop off.
Well, I'm sorry, it would the mid traps comparatively.
Well,
an
the
overhead
trend seems to
shrug.
be the higher sensor placement is, is if this is C7, but actually what we found is that in the overhead shrug is that actually the middle trap picked up a little bit more, which would make sense to me because the middle trap is more like it's the one that's involved in the scapular rotation. I mean, minimally, but as to go up overhead, you need more upward rotation. So relative to the clavicle motion to the scapular motion, there's a lot more clavicle and a lot less scapular motion in a shrug down by your side
Well,
versus
yeah,
here, right?
like
So
these are the super nuanced discussions, right? Because when you're in that straight, like overhead position right there, um, I mean, when you start to go from this overhead position and then come back, like it changed that articulation of the scapula changes, and then it goes
mhm.
from being almost like not very much lower traps to a lot of lower traps, having to help stabilize the scapula, right? So, like those are very nuanced discussions.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
well, and it
for this
depends
one,
on that
because we
loading, right?
all it always depends on loading.
Mhm. Yeah. So the more vertical loading, the less lower trap, but the more if there's any loading moving, posterior to anterior, right? Then the lower traps are going to jump up exponentially.
Jump up, way up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, so let's move on to the stuff from the Johnson study and the anatomy portion, and then if we and then maybe we can come back to this if there's contextual relevance or whatnot.
That was a
Um,
lot of EMG discussion.
yeah, I know, and it sucks because it's a lot of EMG discussion that basically ends up with like, well, we don't have anything that we can be extremely confident with in terms of the data set that we have, right? There's um, yeah, it's limited. The fact that we could argue that, well, we don't know what the upper traps do based off of EMG, in terms of the published data because nobody's measuring them, right? Which is why I took it upon
Well,
myself to try and measure
and
them.
I would suspect that in a proper upper, mid, lower trap EMG measurement study, that the upper traps are going to show up significant. Like that's not something I ever said. My argument's always been what's driving this motion.
So
So,
do
but like
so
we
do
can get
you so you don't disagree with our findings then?
I don't agree that the motion is being driven by the upper traps and clavicle medial rotation. I don't.
But all right, but do you all right, let me ask you this. Based off of what evidence we have in terms of EMG, let's not get into the Johnson stuff right now. We'll go there next, right? Just trying to make this as simple, right? Would you say then that a vertical motion is more upper trap than a horizontal motion, just upper trap by itself? Because that's what we found
that
when we measured just the upper traps, right? And we measured them laterally and anteriorly where there could be no crosstalk from the levator or the middle trap.
well, I don't know how you can say that no crosstalk, but if what you're saying is, um, it depends on what basically what kind of what fascicle areas that we're talking about here. If you mean like for example C6, no. And I don't know how you differentiate that out because clearly, like the C6, its best action is going to be to pull the clavicle posterior. Like is like that's 100% in the Johnson study word for word.
Yeah, I don't think that's what the Johnson study says at all. I think it actually says that those transverse fibers are amazing, and they have a better moment for medially rotating the clavicle than they do posteriorly translating it.
It absolutely says it medially rotates the clavicle. I'm
Yes.
saying that if we could get into that now, like if you want to.
Yeah, we can go there. I just wanted to see if your conclusion in terms of like what we're looking at EMG data, if you did agree that this is going to be higher EMG for the upper trap than this, right? And you say,
I would think I would 100% think that if you're looking at what's getting short, like in like this kind of motion right here, or like even like this kind of motion right here, it you may get more activation from the simple fact that much shorter muscle lengths tend to show up, right? There's a higher degree of rate coding. So there's like you're going to have way more action potentials that are showing up on a surface level EMG due to those short positions.
so
So
so what you're saying is the upper trap shortens the it shortens most when the shoulder
I
is.
like I think
elevate.
if you're way up in, I think the shortest position you're going to get is probably here, where you're going to get some degree of posterior translation with medial rotation.
Yeah,
So,
well,
but
it's good.
again, well, hold up, Cass. The argument is not debating about what's going to show up high on an EMG. This is why I know you well enough to know how you move the goalpost. It's not that. It's about what is driving the motion. And
Okay,
the upper
well,
traps are not driving elevation from a anatomical shoulder position.
okay, we'll get into the Johnson study will be the place that we can get to that. Like, but for context, I'm not looking at this as I'm looking at this through the hypertrophy lens, which I thought that's what you're looking at for two. Is
I
that
am
what is
looking
the
at it as the
motion? What is the
hypertrophy.
motion
If
that
you
would
want to
train
look
the
at it
upper
as the
traps best?
hypertrophy, if you want to look at the hypertrophy lens, like we already have like we have longitudinal hypertrophy studies looking at stuff like shrugs and deadlifts on stuff like neck size. I mean, the upper traps, like I mean, we kind of established that early on that the upper traps don't have a lot of potential for hypertrophy.
The most upper
Okay.
fibers of the upper traps do not have as much potential for
And
the
I
for
think that's
absolute
also an
hypertrophy,
important
right?
distinction
In
here,
terms of
right? Is
size.
like yeah, I think it's an important distinction to understand when we talk about the upper traps. It's almost like you have to divide those kind of in two sections too, because it's the ones coming off the neutral ligaments right there that come down more sloping like this, and then there's the C6 that comes over that actually those fascicles are quite large. So that's kind of a distinction there because, like I said, we have longitudinal hypertrophy research that shows that shrugs and deadlifts and all that kind of stuff don't do anything for neck size,
You're
despite the fact that the upper traps
this
make up like a third of neck volume.
that study you're referring to measured the neck like right below the skull, right?
Right.
So the only trap fibers that it was measuring were like the highest, the ones that attach to like the superior nuchal line, right?
Right.
Like it wasn't measuring any of the lower traps, right? And in fact, in that study, what they found is that the neck training and whatever didn't really impact much of any of that stuff. In fact, some things had like a
The neck
reverse
training actually
action.
increased the neck training, the actual like the neck flexion extension stuff they were doing increased neck size.
Yes, like it
Yeah.
was like 13% of some, but they also saw some muscles go down, and then they saw an inverse reaction to the change in pump, or muscle volume, pre and post training or whatever. But I don't think you can look at that and then make a statement like, oh, we know these exercises don't impact the upper traps because of where they took that measurement so high. I think it's fair to say that in that experiment they didn't see an
So like just
increase
coming
in
back,
those
okay, so coming
fibers,
back
right?
to that, so if we agree on the fact that the upper trap fibers have low degrees of hypertrophy potential, and then
the
the
the highest ones, yeah.
yeah, the highest one. So the only one
Yep.
that you would agree has any potential for like significant hypertrophy is just basically the C6 fascicles.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we look at that we define this as like magnitude of size, right? So because if you
Right.
have a very small muscle and you increase it by 10%, that's still 10%. And if you have a big muscle, you increase it by 10%, it's 10%. But a big muscle increasing by 10% is a much more, it's a
I
bigger
was
change
gonna
in size
say
and
like
visual, right?
10% of a million, 10% of a dollars is just 10 cents. 10% of a million is
Yeah.
significantly different. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So that's essentially what I'm saying, right? Because you have a lower fascicle count and you just have a lower potential in terms of the amount of size that the upper traps can grow to. Just like, you're never going to get your brachialis to be bigger than your biceps, right? That's
Right.
just
All
that's
right.
that's
Of course.
just the way it is, right? So when we're looking
Right.
at traps,
Right.
when we
Right.
say the hypertrophy potential, I want to make sure that people understand that it's an absolute and like total size, not like percentage, because you might be able to hypertrophy your upper
So
trap fibers
if you
like
were doing
a
a vertical shrug, where would you expect to see the greatest amount of hypertrophy occur from that?
Well, if we're looking at actual size, well, then I would expect it to be in the lower portion, that C3 to C6 portion of the lower trap, because that's where you have the most fascicles,
You
right?
mean the lower part of the upper trap is what you're saying.
Yes, the lowest part of the upper trap has the most potential to increase in absolute size, right? And then it decreases as you go higher.
Compared to C7 and T1.
So I would say the C7 to T1, like the middle traps, have a higher potential in terms of absolute size, right? Not
Okay, so
percentage
if
of
you're
growth,
doing
but in terms of absolute size, because
okay,
if you
so
have
if
more
you're doing a
fascicles,
vertical
more of them
shrug,
can
if
grow.
you're doing a if you were doing a vertical shrug, do you agree there's high degrees of activations happening across C7?
Yes.
And of all of those divisions, what division has the largest physiological cross-sectional area between C6 and C7 and C1?
Between C6, C7, and C1, right? The largest total, right? Like,
Yeah, so
the
where if you
absolute.
okay,
So
we'll try this again. We'll try
the
this again.
division, the
Are
middle
are
trap
the
division of
mid
the muscle has the highest volume, has the highest
are the
cross-sectional area
mid
in
trap
total.
are the mid traps C7 super highly active in a vertical stroke?
I don't know how you qualify super highly active, but they are
Okay,
definitely active in a vertical shrug. But
okay.
they are proportionately more active in a retraction or backwards, like a more angular shrug, right? Like from 60
Yeah,
degrees,
like in a row, in a row,
right?
in a row.
Yes. The
Scapular
middle
adduction.
traps.
Yeah, 100%.
The middle
Yes.
traps. Yep.
I'm not
Yes. Okay.
I'm just talking about the vertical shrug here. We're not comparing across all sorts of motions at this moment.
Okay.
If we're
All right.
doing a
Okay.
vertical shrug, are the C7 fibers very, very active? I'm not saying, I'm saying, are they active in comparison to what all is going on in a vertical shrug? Not in a row. Like in the context of isolation in a vertical shrug, are the C7 fibers highly active?
They're active, but I would say the C6, C3 area, the upper traps, would be proportionately more active. And that's exactly what we found.
And would the C7, T1 have more potential for growth based on physiological cross-sectional
Percentage wise, no.
area?
Absolute, yes.
Yes, they
Right?
would, Cass.
Absolute,
Yes, they
yes.
would. Okay, let's
Yes.
get into the
See,
job.
I
Let's
mean,
get
I'm
into
just
the
saying yes.
Johnson's.
But like by total size, not necessarily percentage of size.
The physiological cross-section size of C7 T1 is twice that of C6.
It's not twice that, but it's
Almost twice.
significant. So,
It's what is it? 165. The whole entire upper trap's compared. It's
well,
like
no, you were
165 to
looking.
like
I
two.
was no, that was force capacity 165 versus 205. What you're
Oh
looking
yeah,
at,
force bad. Yeah,
right?
you're right. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
right. So that's not.
yeah.
But I mean,
Okay.
they directly correlate though, right? Because the force
They
capacity
do
is based off
correlate
the
because
right.
because
Yeah. So
larger fascicles can produce more
yes.
force.
Yeah. So the
Right.
middle, like it. So what that shows is that is that upper trap region, right, is about 20% smaller than the middle trap. That's what that is.
That's what I
It's not
said to you
double. It's
last week
20.
when
It's
you
like
were arguing
20%
with me.
different.
I'm like, okay, that's what I said to you last week when you were arguing with me. Like, that's it. Okay, so let's get to the Johnson study.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So what is you like? Let me just let's start with this. What do you think the purpose of the Johnson study was? What were they trying to show?
Um, the purpose of the Johnson study was to look at the origins, insertions, the fascicle links, to look at what their potential actions were going to be at the shoulder. I mean, that's pretty much. I mean, do we need to quote the topic, like the
I mean,
actual what they?
we can like it's right here. It says the relevance of the study was the study refutes misconceptions about the actions of the trapezius and how they are
Right.
conventionally depicted. It brings to
Right.
light the importance of the sternoclavicular joint, not the cervical spine, in sustaining loads borne by the upper limb. Right. And I
Right.
think that's going to be important, in terms of like what they were trying to use. Because like so that they had those two images there, which they were actually the two images that you used in the end of your video, which I'm not sure why you did that, because they were examples of how the traps aren't like these are fake traps. Basically, this is not how it works. The ones with
Which
the
one?
levator figure,
Which ones are you talking about?
the ones that you used at the very end of your video, where it basically shows the upper traps attaching from the scapula to the back of the head, right?
Probably because it's just difficult to find anything illustrated that's accurate.
Yeah, well, I mean, those were those
Okay,
those were
so
the
it's
examples
not
they
that. I
gave
guess
that were
that's my
inaccurate.
point
Yeah,
about this is like are the most of the anatomical illustrations that we deal with not now when it comes to traps not often incorrect. I can show you a multitude of force coupling pictures that list upper traps as going out inserted onto the acromion, which
yeah,
clearly doesn't.
yeah. So, well, I mean, even in the Johnson study here, they have the C6 fiber in their illustration touching the acromion, like, and
It's
they're
not. It's just the way they had to draw it. It looks like that.
yeah. So, I mean, And I mean, I don't know. The traps are also in terms of individualization. They are the muscle that has the most individual variation. Second, or the pecs I think come in second, or it's like one or two depending what you reach in terms of how much variation there is between individuals or whatnot. So I mean, I don't want to, if there's three fibers that slip onto the acromion in one person and not in the other, whatever. Like, I don't think that's worth getting into here. But overall, I think we can agree that, the C6 fibers go the most lateral of the upper trap, but they aren't, even if a few of their fibers do happen to touch the scapula, they're not managing the scapula in any way,
No,
right? Or any
but I
meaningful
guess
way,
we'll have to
right?
set
So
aside. That's, I guess, an agreement is that the upper traps don't insert anywhere on the scapula.
yeah, and even in the case that they do, they wouldn't do to amount that they would significantly influence
Well,
the
in all the
scapula
cadavers they
directly.
looked at, and in every single cadaver they looked at, there was no connection from C6 to C7, not a one.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying that there's not a person in the world that there's not, but I mean, it's good if there was, it would be the exception.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the newer morphological studies, like 2018 to 2022, you'll find some instances and some weird mutations and
I
muscles
I
crossings
think
and all
what some
sorts of
people
stuff in
have
there, right?
a fifth
Right.
quad.
Yeah.
Like
Extra biceps.
there's always anomalies. I think we just like can't
Mhm.
base our whole muscular architecture around
Yeah.
anomalies. So
But the thing is that when you look at this stuff and like the grand total of people that we have is like 50, and they're like, oh, but there was only one anomaly. Like, well, 1 in 50 actually, like when you look at the population, is not extremely low percentage of like zero, right? Like, so if we have a study and it's like, well, they measured 13 cadavers or whatever, like if one of those has a weird thing, right, that's almost, that's like 8%, so it's like it's not a very good. So I just think I just like to
that
be
would
cautious
assume
when it comes to this,
that would
right?
assume that there's always like one in whatever.
Yeah, but it's just, you could make the same in the other direction. That's why I'm just very conservative when I'm like, when we're looking at these things where we just have such a low number of data points, where it's just like, well, what is the absolute? And I'm like, what can we make sure? So where we can agree
Okay, well
is
we'll
that
assume
upper
for
traps are not attaching to the scapula,
we will
right,
assume
in
for
any meaningful way.
discussion that it doesn't, like, the upper traps
It's
don't attach to the scapula because
yes,
we don't have any data showing otherwise at this point. So
yep,
we can
okay,
get past that.
that's fine, right?
Okay.
Okay, so all right, so let's start with the first point in the email here, right, where so this doesn't attach to bone statement, right? Only attaches to the nuchal ligament, which I prefer to use the Miraco version of nuchal ligament. But if you want to say ligamente nuchae over and over again, that'll
I don't want to say that over and over
right. So why do you? So why do you? What is this portion of the argument based off of, that the upper traps can't do shrugs because they don't attach to bone, or however you want to phrase that?
again. So because basically the upper traps, what it does really is just it resists that lateral and not really downward, which is why the C2, like the C6, it only has to be anchored to those ligaments. So instead of the cervical spine. So because the strongest fibers of the upper traps are on like that C6 area, the direction like is almost transverse, right? It's
Mhm.
basically a transverse fiber direction. So the upper traps don't create compressive force on the cervical spine. The weight, basically, the weight of the humerus and the loads that it carries gets transferred over to the sternoclavicular joint by the upper traps. That's what it's doing. So it doesn't elevate the scapula, but it basically uses the sternoclavicular joint to sustain those downward loads that are applied to the humerus. Because right, so what's the sternoclavicular joint is basically connecting the humerus to the body.
Yes, and the scapula and
Right, right.
everything
But it's
from
the
your upper
sternoclavicular
limb.
joint's the only one that's really doing that. So
Okay.
um, that's when you look at it, and especially again when you get into the Johnson study, that does medially pull, right? But it's more like we'd have to get into, and I don't have all morning, but we'd have to get into basically all of the force coupling that's going on between the upper traps, the serratus anterior, the lower traps, and everything at different articulations of the scapula with an elevation and upward rotation.
Mhm.
So, okay, so because you've been asking the questions all morning. All right. My question to you is,
Okay.
why do you feel like if I had a big ship, right, and I put it in a dock, I wouldn't go and take the ropes off to anchor it to seaweed. I would tie it onto the dock,
Mhm.
right? Okay, because that's going to be more stable, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if what I'm
I don't.
saying is, and what the Johnson study is saying is, so when you look at that orientation, like of those the upperest, that's not a word, the upper trap fibers, right? Before we get to the C6, right? Those they come down, but they still come down and insert into that lateral third in a transverse fashion, right? So they basically are going to resist that downward load, right? They're there to basically help stabilize that sternoclavicular joint, right? And like they immediately rotate as part of an accommodating motion of scapular elevation. So that's why,
So
like, when you say, like, well, they're not, I've never said they would show up on EMG. Of course, they have to show up on an EMG, but the actual scapula has to elevate or upward rotate before that motion happens. And Johnson goes into that. And I want to
so
always,
in a shrug, does the scapula have to upwardly rotate?
what do you think is happening in the shrug with the scapula?
Right. So if I do this, is my scapula upwardly rotate, right? Is it turning like this?
No,
Or
it's
is
the
it moving
elevate.
like this? Right. It's
Yeah,
all
right.
right. So
It's
just I
elevate.
just
Like
so okay. So in a shrug, it's not scapular upward rotation.
I
It's
didn't say it was
elevation.
scapular upwards. I said elevation the whole time.
I'm just clarifying, like, because
That's why
it's
earlier I
if we're
said it's
doing
called
this
the
stuff, there's a lot.
levator scapula. Do
Right.
we do agree the scapula can elevate, right?
Yes, the scapula
Okay.
can elevate, but can it elevate without the clavicle medially rotating, right? Because
No,
what is
I've never
medial
said up.
rotation of the clavicle? Right? Like if
Right.
you show me,
It's this way.
right? It's this,
Right.
right? So it's the
Like
lateral end of the
this.
clavicle
Yeah.
going up. This is
But
medial rotation.
did you initially did you not call it I think I screenshotted it. If I have to, like, did you not call it clavicle elevation?
No, said upward
You
rotation
did.
of the clavicle, right? Which is upward rotation and medial rotation of the clavicle are synonymous, right? It
Okay.
never said,
We like
never,
different
yeah,
we like different verbiage.
yeah. So I use upward rotation because medial rotation, like if I'm talking on Instagram, because that's people like that. That's the more understandable. But they're synonyms, and actually upward rotation of the clavicle is actually more common in terms of the description, in terms of anatomy text and whatnot, than medial rotation of the clavicle, which is what they use in the Johnson study. But for all intents and purposes, they're exactly the same thing, right? They're rotation around the sternoclavicular joint, where the lateral, the
Yes.
wide portion of the
Yeah, we
clavicle
can.
is
Okay,
going
we
up,
don't have to
right?
debate the semantics of
Okay.
that. If you want to call it, I just call it medial rotation.
Okay. Right. So I
Okay.
mean, so when I'm talking about this and I'm saying like elevation of the shoulder, right, is kind
Right.
of the lay term that I'm trying to use this, because if you say, like, in the Johnson study, when they say like, well, these cannot exert a elevation, or they wouldn't elevate the clavicle, or they wouldn't elevate the scapula, right? They're talking about forces, not motion. So they're saying that, like, well, the fibers pull medially on the clavicle, they don't
Right.
pull up. That's the whole point of the study. um let me do this so that let me see if this will work here. Will this work? Yeah, can you see that?
I'm trying to see here.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right, so
What
let me
was
go.
that?
What was what?
Never mind.
We'll
You
go.
got some synthalled out guy.
Oh yeah, so that was just, so this was the thing that I was preparing was coming. So this was what they were depicting as, like, this is not upper traps, and I just put this in here like funny. This is like, AKA, like, this depiction is not real world traps. So I put in a picture of not real world traps, right? It's just kind of a, whatever, right? Because that's a depiction, right? Because if your clavicle, or if your upper traps, attached out here and then just like angled straight up, they would look closer
So
to,
if you could
oh god.
literally leave it on this picture right here, right? There's levator
Uh-huh.
right there.
Yep.
Go down. Okay. So then as the levator shorten, what happens with the scapula here?
we can actually let me know if this works, because I bet if I play this, do you still see that?
Yeah.
Like, so you can see me clicking through here. Awesome. Okay, cool. Then my hard work can can actually be useful here, right? So you want to see what the levator would do, right? So if we look at here, right? So this is the levator, right? So in isolation, without coupling, it would pull like that. With the traps, with the middle traps here, the coupling moves the shoulder like that. Basically, what we're looking at for a shrug motion. If it was overly contracting, you would see that, or if the arm were to be more adducted, that would be like the orientation there, right? So, and if we look at this with the upper traps and we look at the coupling, this would be how the levator and the upper traps couple. This is all of the
Right.
traps on there, right? So you can see, basically, I only did upper traps from C3 to C6 because if I do curved lines, they don't work in this animation, and this is the end of my technical ability right here of being able to animate these motions. But this is actually so all of this is the Johnson model animated, right? This is actually
Right.
their image, right? And this is the force coupling that they finished the paper with. This is basically just me animating how that motion works, right? Okay, so you were asking me about anchoring a boat, to seaweed versus, to whatever, to something strong, to the actual whatever you call the things on the dock or whatever, right?
You have to go
So
if you go back to that,
which
go
one?
back to your animation.
Like these guys?
All right.
Okay.
To your animation there. So in your force coupling, like you can't, if you remove, here's what the Johnson study found. So if you were to take that, basically the green line there
Mm-hmm.
of the levator off, like the traps cannot do that elevation and isolation by themselves.
Right. Okay.
Now
So
that's in this.
so you're saying that
No,
this
I didn't say anything. I'm
that
telling you.
all right. Well, you're saying the Johnson study says that this couldn't happen,
Right.
right? Yeah, I don't think that that's what it's saying. It's saying at all,
Okay. Hold on.
right?
Well, then I guess
I think that the statement that I think you're referring to is when they're talking about scapular rotation, not the medial rotation of the clavicle.
I am talking about the fact that you can't. How are you going to isolate medial rotation of? This is like the circular argument that we end up going at. How are you going to medially rotate the clavicle without the scapula elevated? Like
Yeah.
they works together, right?
Yeah, it works together, but the scapula is attached with connective tissue to the clavicle, so that force could be
All right.
transferred.
So
Now I'm not saying
Johnson
in
and
real
Bob
life that the levator would not also be working. I'm just saying that if you were to take somebody and cut out their levator, they would still be able to lift their shoulder, although the scapula being much more unstable, they would still be able to raise the shoulder.
Okay. And you said they didn't just say upwardly rotate, they said elevate too. Johnson and
Yes,
Bogdan found
yes,
okay, let me finish. Johnson and
okay,
Bogdan found that the angle of orientation of the upper fibers of the trapezius are unable to create any significant elevation of the scapula. The arm is in neutral. They also showed that the upper fibers need the coordinated assistance of the lower and middle fibers to upwardly rotate the scapula, highlighting they do not function in isolation. They also found that the trapezius muscle is insufficient to rotate or elevate the scapula alone. Instead, it is coupled action with the serratus anterior that does. So what I'm saying is this illustration that you're providing is showing the force coupling that's happening. And what Johnson is saying that the upper traps cannot do that motion without all of those other components. That's exactly what their wording says verbatim.
okay. So if I pull it up here and we look at that section here, right? Because that's where they're doing the force coupling model for rotation, correct?
They said elevation too.
Yes, they said elevation of the scapula, right? And
Yeah.
so this is
And
one of the
so,
hard things with this paper is a lot of times they're referring to direct force action, right? And saying that it can't do that, which is separate from it couldn't produce a motion of shoulder elevation, right? So what they're saying here and that is that those fibers can't produce a direct force on the scapula and elevation. And that's to me, that's what the paper's right. Is it's this paper is a lot about correcting the semantics in the description. That's why I read the relevance of the paper, right? Because they start off with these examples where they're saying, hey, these diagrams here are depicting the upper traps of having a lifting force on the scapula, where they're like elevating it by pulling vertically, right? And the whole purpose of this paper then works its way to the conclusion that the correct description should be that the traps do not elevate or lift, but what they do is that they pull medially. The lifting then comes secondarily because of the sternoclavicular joint. And I think the tough
So
part about
the
reading this paper is that a lot of times you can take a snippet out of this where they're referring to the direction of forces on these things. But if you have to read through to the full conclusion to what they're saying, the actual outcome of the motions of these.
the
So what they're going to,
actual when you get to the end of the paper, they actually say that the traps do not elevate the shoulder.
that's your, all right. So we can read directly from the end of the paper if you want. I could read the whole last thing,
I mean,
right?
yeah, I mean that's I can like I literally like I think I just read that off, so I feel like that was just kind of ignored. Um, and literally right there, like from the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the actions of the upper traps are to draw the clavicle backwards immediately, which we agree on, but it doesn't have the ability to actually elevate the shoulder.
Right. Okay. So do you see the contradiction in those two statements if you don't apply the context of one's
The
referring to force and
context has to
motion,
be that
right?
there's a lot of things. Okay, what I just said was, and what Johnson said is that in an isolated format, the upper traps cannot, they don't have the ability to elevate the shoulder. And what you'll go to next part is I already know what you're going to say is that they can do so by another mechanism, but that
Mm-hmm.
mechanism involves the serratus anterior and it involves the force coupling that's going to go on. But that has to happen. The initial, what is going to cause the initial motion at the scapula is going to be by the levator, which is why, again, it shows up as the highest in a vertical shrug when we look at EMG with fine wire implementation.
The only
So
time they're
so
referencing the
so
serratus
so if
anterior
my point is
is
in a
for upward
neutral shoulder
rotation.
position, in a neutral shoulder position, Johnson is saying the upper traps cannot drive that motion. They're not the ones driving that motion. Like from a neutral shoulder position, they don't have the ability. So let's say if we have to go to the part where um let's see here.
I have the paper pulled up if you want to
Okay,
tell me where
yeah.
you are.
So it is apparent. Okay, it is apparent from the orientation that the neutral portion of the trapezius is a poor elevator of the scapula, since their small size limits their strength in this action, and the rest of the fibers have much more of a transverse direction. Also, the fibers are in the clavicle, not the scapula, which we already know. The action of the upper trapezius, based on this orientation, will draw the clavicle backwards immediately, but not upwards. So here's the contention.
Mm-hmm.
If is a vertical shrug, this is the only thing to agree on. If you're saying that the vertical shrug is actually being driven by medial rotation of the clavicle, where I'm saying a vertical shrug is being driven by scapular elevation. That's the only that's the whole point of that we're arguing.
Okay. Well,
And
I agree there.
Johnson says that from a neutral shoulder position, the upper traps in isolation can't perform that motion. It's an accommodating motion by the upper traps, just like in a row. A row is not driven by clavicle posterior translation. A row is scapular adduction, and then the upper traps that are pulling the clavicle posterior are accommodating that motion. Or do you not agree with that?
Okay, so where I'm going to disagree with you here is that so in this context, when they're saying that they can't contribute or that they don't do upward rotation or elevation, right? Is that they're referring to the exact forces that are being applied, meaning that they cannot when they're saying elevation. I don't know. This my stupid filter's not moving, or so they're saying like an elevation. They're saying this motion, right? Is that it can't do this, right? It can't do this.
Cass, we don't
Right.
have to do this all day. This is really simple. Do you think a vertical shrug is scapular elevation?
Do I think it
Don't
is scapular
say the
elevation? No.
scapular is elevating. I'm asking you.
No,
It's
I
like
don't think it's
saying
scapular elevation.
you don't.
Like I don't think it's being driven by scapular elevation. No, I don't think it's like we can go I can sit here and I can walk through why that's not even possible. So if we look at can I run
Hold
with
on,
this for a
hold up.
second?
Time out. Time out.
Can I
Time
run
out.
with this
Time
for a
out.
second?
Did
All
you
right, go
just
ahead. Do your
say
thing.
that's not even possible? You just said that's
So
not even possible.
like if you let me finish the context of that, I can say that. If you want to just stop me there, then I'm sure you can take me to like, some
I'm just
absurd
like I
statement.
just want to clarify because like pretty much every orthopedic physiological textbook, anything we can think of, a shoulder shrug is the shoulder moving this way.
Yes, it is the shoulder raising. It is the shoulder elevating, but it is not being driven through the scapula itself being pulled vertically.
Then what is levator scapula doing in that motion?
Okay, so the levator scapula, like it does pull the scapula up, right? But it also rotates it, and it also pulls it medially as well, right?
Right.
So,
It also actually downwardly rotates it too.
well, that's what it does. It doesn't upwardly rotate. It downwardly rotates it while it elevates it,
I
right?
didn't
That's what
say
it does.
upwardly rotate. I said, does it elevate it? Bro, this is starting to get super frustrating because you keep changing the verbiage. I said elevation. I didn't never said upwardly rotate. Those are two very different mechanisms by the scapula.
Okay.
I'm asking you in a shrug, in a vertical shrug. I didn't say upward rotation one time. You have changed that on me over and over again. And you're changing that to try to fit your argument. So in a shrug, is the scapula being elevated? Period. Stop saying upwardly rotate.
All right.
Is it being elevated? Is it being pulled in elevation by the levator scapula? Or is this
The
the fine wire EMG? Is it just a fucking made up study, dude?
so is the levator working a lot? Yes. If you want to talk about what's driving the force in terms of overcoming the loads that would be pulling down on the shoulder, then no, the levator would not be the thing that is overcoming those loads, overcoming the resistance in the shrug by lifting up. So in order
It's
for the
not the
levator
upper
to
trap,
lift,
which Johnson documented that what it's doing is helping to sustain the sternoclavicular joint against downward compression loads on the humerus. So it's not the clavicle upper traps are not dry. It's not a clavicle motion. The clavicle is moving is medially rotating to accommodate the loads at the humerus, but the motion is being driven by the scapula.
so the upper
It's called,
traps just lift the weight of the clavicle and nothing
it is
more.
medially rotating the clavicle to sustain those loads at the sternoclavicular joint. That's in the paper.
So the
So, like, comes back to the thing that you have done on a multitude of occasions where you literally just change all of these things anatomically that there's nothing like supporting. So, like with so is the Johnson paper okay? So the EMG fine wire study, is it just junk? Is the Johnson paper just junk?
No, I think the Johnson paper is great. So right now we keep cutting each other short, right? And I think what needs to happen is either I need to be able to walk through my explanation, and then you can, then you can go through it rather than stopping me short, or vice versa,
Here's the reason
right?
why I didn't really necessarily do this, because if you can't even agree that a vertical shrug is scapular elevation, we don't have anything else to talk about. Like, that's pretty much factual. It's kind of like saying the lats don't do shoulder adduction in the frontal plane when they do. Like, to say that they don't because they don't have the 3D modeling of the rib cage is insane.
I'm
So
saying the same thing that the Johnson study says is that even
I
though the scapula does elevate, right, in terms of the forces, right, the forces are not coming from being pulled from the cervical down, right? But they're the force of being able to raise the clavicle and the scapula in this medial rotation of the clavicle and simultaneous elevation of the scapula, that motion is driven more by the transverse forces, right? And then that the force then is therefore able to be transferred to the sternoclavicular joint. Because if it was from the being pulled forces from like the levator or the highest fibers of the upper trap,
Again,
then you would be pulling back on the neck and the head
this is a
to
really simple
drive the
thing. The
motion.
Johnson study did not come back to say a vertical shrug is a clavicle motion. It says if the clavicles get pulled medially by the upper trap fibers. However, that it's what the motion that's occurring there is scapular elevation. And then that it's apparent, this is in the Johnson study, from the orientation of the nuchal portion of the trapezius, that's a poor elevator of the scapula, especially since their small size limits their strength in this action. You keep talking about force production, and he addresses that too, and says their small size is not able to create significant forces and able to perform this action. So how you keep, here's the funny thing, you create this argument in your study or in your mind, and then you come to a different conclusion than I came to, or that Chris came to, or anybody else who reads the Johnson study, that somehow the upper traps are driving this motion when they are small and insignificant and able to produce significant force to do that. And that Johnson has to run roundabout to say, hey, look, the traps are not really basically doing scapular elevation. So what's going to be doing it is going to be driving that motion is going to be levator scapula until there's a significant amount of upward rotation that happens. And then the force coupling happens between the upper traps, the serratus anterior, and then the lower traps. And I didn't even get to that part. The upper traps can only really contribute to that scapular upward rotation and elevation once the arm gets into a certain degree of like slight abduction. So the mid traps, those fibers point slightly upwards from the scapula to the spinal column, so they can do some elevation once they get some leverage there to do so. So my thing is this: is like and I said this before, like I have presented you with a multitude on other topics, a multitude of data on other topics that no matter how much this keeps coming out, you'll just
All right,
continue to
before
argue.
you go, could you just give me a few minutes to just walk through my full explanation? And then if you want to be like poo-poo on UCAS, then I will give you all the time that you want to do that. Can you do me that?
Well,
Can
I think
can you just give me the time to just read a few things, show a few things, and then you can criticize it. You can say I'm wrong, you can say I'm misinterpreting it, you can say it's my ego, all of that stuff. But can you just let me
I already know that. But go ahead.
go through it and finish the thought? Right. Okay.
Oh,
So
okay.
just let me walk through this from just A to Z, right? And then instead of like going through the little snippets, right? So starting with the abstract here, right? Just
Right.
like what they're saying here, right? And just getting this, right? Okay. So dissection studies revealed the fascicle anatomy of the trapezius, its occipital, blah blah blah. Just going through the anatomy, right? Its thoracic fibers converge in the deltoid, whatever. Okay. The essentially transverse orientation of the upper and middle fibers of the trapezius precludes any actions as elevators of the scapula as commonly depicted, right?
Right.
And as commonly depicted means they don't elevate in the way that they showed in the figures,
From
this way
anatomical
and this way,
position.
right? So they don't elevate the scapula by pulling upward on it from the cervical spine and the head. That's exactly what they're saying there, right? So, right, just let me keep going here. I know you want to jump in, right? Okay. Rather, the
I'm
actions
not
of these
jumping in.
fibers is to draw the scapula and the clavicle backwards or to raise the scapula, right? To raise the scapula by rotating the clavicle about the sternoclavicular joint. Okay. And sentence. By balancing moments, the trapezius relieves the cervical spine of compression loads. So let me
That's
continue.
exactly what
Let me
I. That's
continue going on.
exactly what. That's
Okay.
exactly what I said verbatim.
All right. Cool. So now let me just switch over to the other thing that I had here. Right. Okay. So we have we have the Johnson model of the C6 fibers here, right? So I'm just gonna play this here. I'm not going to read all the text on these things or whatever, right? So this is their force coupling model. So this is essentially the right going through the C6. This is what medial rotation is based off of the Johnson study. This is medial rotation of the clavicle, upward rotation of the clavicle, right? So this is the motion that they're saying this is how the transverse fibers would lead to elevation of the scapula, would be by this mechanism here, which then instead of having to pull down on the head and the neck, right, allows the force to be transverse through the nuchal ligament so that basically you can transfer the load in your arm to your trunk and not your head and neck, right?
So
This is the
what's
false
going on right
depiction.
there? What is going on right there is exactly what it said in there. It's basically the upper fibers are helping to transfer the load to the sternoclavicular joint. Is that not correct?
So
Is it,
yeah.
okay? So
Yeah, so
okay,
so
okay.
so so ba- so they lift the shoulder. They raise the shoulder by pulling horizontally because they have a pivot point, which is the sternal. That is the
They,
joint of
that all of
the
that
joint of the
requires all of
shrug.
that requires
Can I
all of
finish?
that requires context that you left out.
I'm not done yet.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm just walking through their false depiction here on the left. This is what they're saying isn't happening. It's not this pulling up, right, that leads to this, right? So the stuff in the yellow on the left, that's what's not happening. It's this pulling across that's resulting in the pivot, right, around the sternoclavicular joint that is there. So, right. So the correct way to describe this, right, would be a transverse pull into medial rotation, not a vertical pull or a elevation pull to lift, right? To me, that is what the main point, right? And to just show this in another part of the body, this is the brachioradialis doing the same thing to flex the elbow, right? All these compressive forces are then being transferred to the elbow joint, and that it's essentially still lifting the hand, even though when it's lifting the forearm, it's raising it, even though it's not doing it by pulling upward, it's doing it by pulling it transversely, transferring the force into the joint, right? And that's
Right.
what leads to
Right. Hold
this
on.
motion.
Okay, right. Because the transverse upper trap fibers balance out that movement caused by the vertical load on the shoulder, and then they transfer to the sternoclavicular joint.
Sternoclavicular
That
joint,
is
right?
okay. That is the part that you're not addressing. So something has to be driving the vertical motion. What is driving the vertical motion? It's not the clavicle. Let me repeat this again. The transverse upper trap fibers balance the movement caused. This is Johnson. You're missing this sentence. The transverse upper trap fibers balance the movement caused by the vertical load on the shoulder, which is transferred from the shoulder joint. But the upper trap fibers cannot create the vertical motion. Okay, so it's the upper trap fibers balance that movement of the vertical motion by transferring the load to the sternoclavicular joint. That's the whole point of the paper. So what is causing the vertical motion of the shoulder? I'm going to repeat this again and again and again. The transverse upper trap fibers balance the movement caused by the vertical load on the shoulder, which is transferred to the sternoclavicular joint. So everything I said there the whole time is the Johnson study, is the upper trap fibers are stabilizing the sternoclavicular joint, transferring that load to it in order to compensate for the motion that's happening vertically. So what motion is happening vertically there?
Okay,
Elevation of scapula. Elevation of
so
scapula.
so I am looking at the paper right now, right, and I'm not seeing that what you're quoting
The
right here.
transverse upper trap fibers balance the movement. That's
Balance the
basically what
movement
is
or
happening.
balance the moments,
The
right? Because
the
they have in
move
here that balance the moments, which that is true,
right.
but not balance the movement,
So
and that's a
what are
different
they
thing. This
right?
is says they're balancing the moments, which is what I'm going to get to.
So the entire paper talks
So
about
it's
that
not balancing the
elevation.
movements; it's balancing the moments exerted by the load, not balancing the
Right.
movement,
So
balancing
what
the
is
moment.
by the caused by what by the vertical motion at the shoulder? And it
So
states that the upper traps cannot vertically elevate the shoulder, right? So what's happening there with the upper trap fibers is that they are immediately rotating the clavicle to compensate for that motion to transfer the load to the sternoclavicular joint. That's what the paper goes over and over again. So
I'm gonna Bernie Sanders you here and just say, like, once again, will you
No, you got,
let
dude,
me
this is,
finish?
it's like 12:20. I don't even know when we started, but I told you this is why, because nothing can change your mind. Nothing. So
You
what
know,
else do you have to close? What else do you have to close with?
okay, well, the vertical, like, what is balancing the vertical forces, right? Like, so, you know what the compression in the sternoclavicular joint, you know how that's referring to, right? So
Yes.
it's a set. So let me go back to the brachioradialis here, right? So as if this is pulling in to lift the hand here, right? What is balancing the vertical forces? Well, it is actually this joint and the transverse force. The coupling of that is what's balancing and overcome. Like, to lift, all that needs to happen is the amount of pull in this transverse, right, is able to then transfer more force into the elbow joint than what is being pulled down, and then the joint goes up. If it exceeds that, then the joint pivots down. That's the simple mechanics of, you know, shortening and lengthening here, right? So what is doing the vertical lifting? It's the transverse pull is doing the vertical lifting. How is it able to accomplish that? Well, it's able to accomplish that by using the sternoclavicular joint as an axis, right? So that means that, like, the more that load is pulling down, the more it's pulling into the
But the
sternoclavicular joint.
load,
So
right. This is going to be the last thing I'm going to say. Even in the Johnson paper, the load is happening, the forces are happening vertical at the shoulder. And his whole point was is that the traps are not driving that vertical shoulder motion. The whole point is of the paper is to say the traps don't elevate the shoulder, and that what the upper traps are doing is helping to sustain and transfer those loads to the sternoclavicular joint as a stability factor. And then there's the force coupling, which we didn't even get into. I said this whole time, there's nothing that's going to convince, once you get your mind like made up, there's nothing that changes. My question is, what conclusion do you think Chris is going to come to, for example, when he reads the Johnson paper? What do you think he's going to say?
I mean, far be me to come, to, say with anything else. But I mean, if he does, if Chris models, if Chris models this thing, appropriately, then he would come to the same conclusion I am, which is, I'm arguing is the same conclusion that they have in the Johnson study, right? That the majority of the forces in terms of being able to elevate the shoulder come from the traps pulling transversely and then redirecting those forces into the sternoclavicular joint. Because if they
Well, I mean,
came from the levator, right, that would mean the compression would be being applied to the cervical spine. So I'm not saying that the levator isn't working its little heart out, right? It's definitely working, but you can't transfer all of this force to the back of the head. So there's going to be a limitation in terms of the amount of
you
force
don't
produced by
transfer
the
all of the
levator.
force to you don't transfer all of the force to the back of the head. That's why Johnson goes into the force coupling that goes on there between the anterior serratus, right? That's going to apply an equal and opposite force motion to create stability at the
That's in
scapula.
rotation, not elevation, but yes, the everything is working in some instance, right? But the long and short of it is that the force has to be transferred to the trunk somewhere, right?
Right.
The serratus can do that, the traps can do that. Even the levator does it a little bit with its somewhat of a medial pull, right? And even the
No, it's not
rhomboids do
like
it a
it's
little
not.
bit.
No, it's not like that. The serratus anterior in a shrug is just sitting there doing nothing.
I didn't say they're
But
doing
there's
nothing.
like, yes, as the arm gets higher, you're going to have more levator involvement. But I'm saying, if I don't know what else to say at this point, other than the fact is that the Johnson paper clearly goes into the fact that the upper traps neither have the orientation nor the size nor than anything else to go from a neutral shoulder position to do shoulder elevation. Your argument is a shrugs, there's not even shoulder elevation. So there's like that was what I said. That's why I asked you before. I was like, what is it you want to get out of this? Because if we can't even agree that a vertical shrug is shoulder elevation, the argument goes nowhere.
It is shoulder elevation, right? You wanted to corner me into saying it's just scapular elevation so that you could use a quote in the
I
Johnson study,
never
be like,
said
oh, it
that. You're
says that,
putting words
right?
in my mouth, dude. I'm so done with this. I never said that. Clearly, I've said over and over again. You're the one that's changed this. said over and over again, the clavicle has to be pulled medially in order to accommodate the elevation of the scapula. There is no place on the face of the planet where a shoulder shrug, a vertical shoulder shrug, is called anything other than scapular elevation, and you have changed that to be a clavicle motion to fit your argument. Can you go
cannot
find me a
elevate.
reputable? I didn't say you can't. Kaz, I'm done. I'm done. Do you not see? This is why I'm not going to spend my day arguing with you. I've never said one time you can't elevate the shoulder without an accommodating clavicle motion. Have I said that over and over again? Yes or no? Don't talk for 10 minutes. Have I said over and over again? Okay.
You have said that.
Okay. So if we can't, from the start, I asked you through DMs, but you wouldn't answer it. I said, can you even agree that what is being driven here is scapular elevation? You have changed the whole argument and moved the goalpost, as you usually do, to try to fit your argument. And no,
the last sentence of the Johnson study is, by elucidating this mechanism, we seek to stem the misrepresentation of the trapezius as an elevator of the scapula and to emphasize the role of the sternoclavicular joint in sustaining downward loads to the upper limb, right? Saying that the important thing is this action, right? It's the sternoclavicular joint. What moves at the sternoclavicular joint? It's the difference between the sternum and the clavicle.
Everything you just read is everything I've already said this whole time. Okay? Everything you just read is everything I've said this entire discussion. My point is, what if a vertical shrug is elevating the scapula? The clavicle gets pulled medially to accommodate that motion. They all work together, but it is not a clavicle. Can you find me one reputable textbook that says a vertical shrug is a clavicle exercise? Are orthopedics out there doing work on the clavicle, or they do work on the scapula for this stuff?
Okay, let me just confess. Okay, all right, let's say that the levator drives the motion. All of, let's just say the upper traps do not drive.
Well, you like to throw out the EMG that proves you wrong, but go ahead.
I didn't throw out the EMG that proves me wrong. And I mean, I agree with the data that's there. And all I said is that there's no data that says there's no upper trap. I interpreted the data as the data is. That's all that I did.
You have straw man this whole thing. This has been so ridiculous. You have straw man this whole thing. Where did I say the upper traps never did anything? Can you tell me that?
So
where did I say the upper traps don't?
You just said
where did I say the upper traps do nothing? What did I say the upper traps do in a shrug? What did I say the upper traps do in a shrug? Because you
never said that they do zero, right? So, but my argument is that a shrug motion is still going to be the better way to train the upper traps, right?
And it's not.
Okay, what's a fully shortened upper trap?
A fully shortened upper trap, would absolutely be the arm all the way overhead.
Okay, but so in relationship, is the shortest upper trap going to be in the highest degree of clavicular medial rotation?
Stop. In a shrug, it's not a fully shortened upper trap or mid trap. So what would it be?
It's not. Well, it's not a fully shortened anything in a shrug. Nothing fully shortens in a shrug.
I just said that, dude. Wow. I just said it's not.
So I'm just.
I just said it's not a fully shortened upper trap. I just said it's not a fully shortened mid trap. I just said it's not a fully shortened mid trap.
I'm not saying that you didn't.
These conversations with you don't go anywhere because you're just out to argue. You're just out to argue. Like it doesn't go anywhere because no matter what I say, you argue. I literally just said shrug's not a fully shortened upper trap. It's not a fully shortened mid trap, is it?
No,
it's not.
Well, not a shrug like this. Now, an overhead shrug is going to be a fully shortened upper trap.
I would agree with that. And why is that?
Why is that in this instance? Well, it's because once you get up here, you can medially rotate the clavicle to its last bit.
Right. But if you're in that position, and doing an overhead shrug like that, is that a good upper trap motion?
Yeah.
Do you think that is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, so I mean, here's my thing, right? Like what I'm not saying that you said the traps do zero. What I'm saying is that if we look at the types of motions that would be used to train the upper trap, they would still be vertically biased, whether they be overhead shrugs, whether they be shrugs down here, right? I think that everything that we
You
have,
have you have you have
nothing.
have you have zero data to show that any of these motions would be upper trap bias.
Well, one, I have my own data, but you can go ahead and throw that out because you say that's biased, right?
And what I said
Okay,
about your own data was I said, which we covered in the early part of the EMG stuff, was I said the only way that you can make a claim like that is if you contrast it to the deep muscles of stuff like the rhomboids and the fader to show which one's more active. And then again, in that position, you like to move the goalpost and you say, well, activation doesn't mean anything. But when you do your own research, it does mean anything.
I don't
That's
need
what I
the
mean
other
about this
data to
discussion.
show that a vertical motion, the upper traps read higher than the upper traps do in a retraction motion, right? I don't
Okay.
like I don't need it to make that claim, right? I didn't say that the upper traps were more biased than the levator in a vertical shrug. I said that the upper traps themselves were being recruited to a higher degree in a vertical motion than they were in a horizontal motion. That's all that I
right. So
showed. That's all that I showed.
right. And then a shorter in an incredibly short position like that, you also agreed when we first started talking that it could register out super high on EMG. And the biggest reason why is because you're going to have a higher degree of rate coding, okay, especially when you use those really, really short positions.
Well, this is why I compared the same relative range of
Mainly because
motion to itself.
you're usually going to be in a position of active insufficiency in those positions. So when you're dealing with surface level EMG, that's another shortcoming that you're dealing with that. So this is why you can't just look at EMG, which I didn't. I said you have to be able to contrast it to what we see going on in the deep muscles. And then you like to each time move the goalpost that there's something that doesn't back up your theory. So if we have a fine wire EMG that looks at surface level and fine wire EMG muscles that doesn't support your theory, then you don't like parts about that. But when you go and slap on surface level EMG and stuff on people in your gym and you consistently find the same results that you want to find over and over again, I don't know what to do with that.
Well, so when you say levators, are more
I
active here,
don't say
or
it.
what?
I
No,
don't.
I'm agreeing with you on all of that. The only thing
Okay,
I'm
so
adding to
is
that,
a vertical. Okay, so according to the Johnson study and according to the Kassem study, a, a shoulder shrug, a vertical shoulder shrug, is scapular elevation. And the upper traps and mid traps can't do that motion from an anatomical position. And especially the upper traps is to sustain the downward loads that's going to happen at the humerus to help stabilize the sternoclavicular joint. They're not driving the motion. Okay.
okay,
There is 100% medial rotation that's happening at the clavicle. It has to accommodate the upwards, the elevation of the scapula, which is being driven by initially by the levator. And then once the actual shoulder elevates, the clavicle gets pulled medially. And then the upper or the mid trap fibers have some leverage in order to help, just like your little drawing there shows. So what I'm saying is you have to, the source of contention here is to say, is a vertical shrug being driven by scapular elevation or is it being driven by clavicle medial rotation? And
no, you're making that the argument. My argument is not that. My argument is that if you want to train the traps, then the upper traps, then elevation of the shoulder is a good exercise for them, right? That's what takes them. That you can argue that what they're doing at the clavicle is less significant than but that is what they do.
I
That
would
is like you
not.
have to train the motion that they do. You have to train them from in a path of motion that lines up with their line of pull, that goes from their shortened and lengthened position. And what I'm saying is what's in the
That's
Johnson
not.
study, what's
Do
in the
is
EMG
there?
shows that you would. This is like you can argue that I'm not arguing like what is driving the motion most and all of that stuff. It's more so
That's
getting
the
back
basically.
to
Isn't that what we're
upper
always trying to
traps.
find with movements? Is what's driving those joint ranges of motion? I mean, that's pretty much what we do, and trying to figure out good exercises is for good motions. What is driving those?
There's a strong correlation there, but when it comes to, especially when we get into smaller muscles or we look at movements that aren't particularly biased, like everything at the shoulder is a complex movement that is requiring an orchestration of a lot of muscles, right? So so I'm not saying, well, it's, this is the driver, whatever. What I'm saying is that if you want to train upper traps, right, is that, well, they immediately rotate the clavicle, right? You can argue that that doesn't drive
Do they
scapular
post?
elevation,
Do they
right?
posterior trans? Do they posterior
Right?
translate the clavicle?
Yes, they do, but not to the same degree. They have a greater moment to medially rotate the clavicle than they do to posterior translate. They go through a greater range of motion in medial rotation than they do in posterior translation, right?
And
The
the
middle
five
the
and
middle the middle traps have significantly more bias towards posterior translation than they
the
do
orient
towards
the fiber
they're
orientation.
lower on the axis, they're more transverse, they have a greater moment for posterior translation, they have a greater impact of the rib cage to pull into retraction and
What
posterior translate.
what are you telling me that the C6, which is the largest, right? Those are
Mhm.
the large fascicles of the upper traps. What do they have the best leverage to do?
Medially rotate.
No,
Yeah.
no. It's to like when you look at the orientation of the fibers, which way do they run?
When we look at the orientation, well, they're right here, right?
Right. So
The
which one's
The
C6?
C6 fibers are at
Right.
18 degrees. Here's the sternoclavicular joint right here. Here's this
Right.
moment, right? Look at this moment. The moment basically
Right.
goes from whatever this is, T3 to like the height of between C6 and C7, right? That's a pretty, substantial moment, right? I don't have the moment drawn on here, but you don't have to be a genius to realize that the amount, right? And you can see what it would have to pull. You don't have to be a genius to realize that the moment here for posterior translation is significantly less than what it is for medial rotation.
The and it can't, as defined in the Johnson study, can't do that without what?
You can't do that. Well,
Yeah,
you're
from an
referring to the
anatomical
section
position,
in
what can
terms
it do?
of
What
rotating the scapula. It cannot rotate the scapula without the other things. Can it medially rotate the clavicle on its own? Yes, it can.
not no, not in isolation. That again, that's like all of that has to happen at once. So again, in a vertical shrug, my
Dude,
whole argument the entire time is
I
what's
guarantee you,
driving.
if you cut out all of the rest of the traps, you cut out the levate, you cut out every single other muscle on the shoulder, and you only had the upper traps, they would immediately rotate the clavicle in isolation on their own.
It would it would immediately rotate the clavicle, but what happens when you add load? When
It
you
would
go
mean
to when
it
you
would
go
still
how
overcome
are
that
you
load
going to
because it has the
okay
sternoclavicular
how
joint.
are you going to immediately rotate the clavicle without the shoulder elevated? Can you do it?
You don't. That's why when you're like, oh, well, you can't because it does this doesn't
So
mean
it
shoulder
doesn't happen
elevation.
in
I'm saying that
okay, so it
I'm
doesn't happen
saying
in
that
isolation, like I
if the
said.
clavicle goes up, the scapula comes up with it always. The
It's
scapula
the
can rotate without the clavicle going up, but the scapula cannot go up without the clavicle medial rotating.
right.
Just like
Like
the
I said,
scapula can't
you
protract or
there
retract
was
without the clavicle moving.
right, and then the upper traps. The entire point of Johnson study was to show that the traps don't do shoulder elevation, which is the point of the
They
study.
don't do
So
scapular elevation.
scapular
They
elevation.
shouldn't be described as lifting the scapular up. They should be described as pulling the clavicle medially. That's the point of the Johnson study.
The point was both was what's happening with the traps in those motions.
But you can't
Okay.
separate the fact that if the clavicle is pulled medially, that the scapula will also
Okay.
raise
I'm
up.
I am I have this has been going on for hours. I told you before, there's no amount of data changing my
All
here's
right.
the thing.
I
I'm not changing my
apologize if you think this wasted your time, Paul. I'm sorry I didn't get to finish my explanation. You're right. Despite this disagreement, like I
oh
have no hard feelings or anything, right?
don't victimize yourself.
I'm
Like
not
I'm sure
victimizing myself,
I'm
right?
sure you will have
I just don't want you to be
you
like
will
upset
have
about anything that
plenty of
happened.
future opportunities to try to discredit me. So like you can just use this one, another one. Like I said, I knew you were like you. This was like I'm gonna goad Paul into getting on to this. Like I've explained. I think I have sufficiently explained my side of things. I'm pretty sure also that other people are going to come to the same conclusion. Look at these studies that I did.
I've
This is
sent the Johnson paper to a bunch of people, and I mean, maybe that's something you should do. And nobody has like everybody has read that and interpreted that like, oh, this means like, yeah, actually, doing a shrug
there's a
motion would still be good
again
for upper traps.
this is again this is, you keep saying or implying that I've said, and I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna go.
Well,
And
will you
I
finish
have
with
said
this?
over
What
and
do you
over
think is
again, the
good
upper
for upper
traps
traps?
medially rotate the clavicle, but a shrug is scapular elevation.
What exercise? So how should we train upper traps? That's really all that matters.
Absolutely.
How
The
should we
way that
train
I
upper
would
traps?
recommend to train, the way that I would recommend to train the upper traps would be something like a Kelso shrug or a horizontal shrug to
Mhm.
actually train the upper trap fibers in their design orientation and pull the clavicle posterior, because you're going to be able to load it better there too. So, like,
So you
for
wouldn't
example,
train the medial rotation function, you would just do the posterior translation function.
the medial rotation function will get trained as a byproduct of doing stuff like overhead work, won't it? So if you do something like a Lou raise, or you do like a Y raise, is the upper traps, are they medially rotating the clavicle in those motions?
Well, so I'm not saying that you have to shrug by any
I'm
means,
asking
but
you.
I'm
I
saying
you,
that
you I
but
asked
those
a question. Can
exercises
you
are
answer
good.
it,
I'm
bro?
answering it,
You are
right? I
you
think those
are
are good exercises, and I think
when
if
you
you're doing those,
do.
you don't need to shrug.
We just okay. We just said earlier in this motion right here, are the upper traps the shortest? So if
So
you asked me a question, you said, how would you train them? I said that you train them they get trained as a byproduct of those motions, do they not? So if you
mhm.
do a Y
Yeah,
raiser, you
I
do,
think
if you,
yes, exactly. You're on a good point. If you're doing motions like that, then you wouldn't need to include shrugs, right?
okay,
And
right.
that's my that's why I'm not pro shrug by any mean. I'm not like Captain Shrugs. You know what we do, like how much time, like how much shrug content have you seen? All so I think that if you're doing lateral raises, you're doing Lou raises, you're doing Y raises, you're doing any fucking heavy fucking pulls, whatever, like you're training the medial rotation in a variety of things. And so you likely may not need more volume to do that. But I would say the same thing in terms of like, well, do you need to do Kelso you know shrugs? Well, it depends how
I
many
don't,
rows
and
and other things that you're doing,
you
right?
asked me a question. You asked me if I was going to train
The upper
upper
traps,
the upper
right?
traps, and like that was the area I wanted to significantly bias and actually
Hmm.
hit those upper trap fibers. And yes, I would do something like a horizontal based shrug. And I also know that they're also going to get a pretty good stimulus from exercises where I have to bring the arm all the way overhead, and then that clavicle gets rotated immediately very short. So
Hmm.
you're asking me like, how would I train them? Well, I'm not going to train them using a vertical shrug, right? Because what's going to be doing the driving that motion, doing the majority of work is scapular elevation. It's going to be driven by the levator scapula, which is why it's called that. And then I feel like it's going to be the mid traps, which we do have a ton of data on. Does it mean the
Uh-huh.
upper traps are doing nothing? Of course not.
Yeah.
So I'm going off the data that we have. I'm not just like making stuff up.
Okay. Well, my disagreement and where the final point, or of contention can be is that I think regardless of the levator's contribution, that doing exercises that are loading the medial rotation are still good exercises for training the upper trap. I don't think that just because the levator EMG was high there means that, a shrug would not be good for training the upper trap, or a slightly, incline shrug would not be good, or that overhead shrugs would not be good, or any other vertical motion, right? I think that, in terms of going through their range of motion, lining them up, et cetera, that I think that,
I think
you need a
because
component of both things, the medial rotation of the clavicle and the posterior translation to train them completely. And if we're talking about the upper fibers might be more involved in, like, the superior nuchal line fibers could possibly be more involved in gait and neck motion than they are in actual the shrug motion right there, you know,
yeah, they would be.
so.
So if you were doing something like cervical extension,
Yeah, well, it's capital, it's not cervical. So like it's this, not like, so it's not leaning your head back, it's
right?
pulling your
That's what I
chin up.
mean. Like,
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
like
So it's yeah, capital extension is what the superior
yes, that
nuchal
if you're actually
line
trying to
fibers would be doing.
train
Right.
those
Hmm.
nucleine um fascicles of the upper traps, that's the motion you
Yeah.
want to do.
Because if you want to fully shorten those, you have to do this and raise your shoulder, both. And it
I just
actually
the
limits how much you raise your shoulder.
there's two points of this, and then I'm going. Is that number one? The upper trap fibers that people talk about, they are consistently confusing that with mid traps. The really big, thick, meaty traps people talk about is mid traps. The actual upper trap fibers are relatively small. That's a consistent problem with people saying, "Oh, well, that's upper traps." I'm like, that's actually mid traps, and the fact that one attaches at C6 and the other one's at C7, they're very close together. So visually, when you look at them, most people don't understand that what they're actually looking at, those really big, thick, meaty ones, are the mid traps.
Yeah.
That's the
Well, I mean,
C7 and T2.
it's it's the majority of the volume of your trap is T1 to C3. Like that's what is it? I can't remember. It's over 50% of the
Right,
volume of the whole
right.
trap,
Okay. And
right?
so
And
when
the majority
people,
of that
well,
volume is C7 and C6. So I think it's just fair to say that the majority of what people are looking for hypertrophy is the lowest portion of the upper trap and the highest portion of the middle trap.
right. But the portion they talk about that like they think is upper traps, most of the time, that's what they're talking about is actually mid traps. Is that those C7
If they're
fibers.
talking about
That's
the C7, yeah, right. I
Yes,
mean,
they're
so yeah,
common C7, and they
yeah.
call those upper traps, which is why they get measured, have been measured like that incorrectly for a very long time. Those are
Yeah.
not upper traps; those are mid traps. But
So
people
can we
look at those and go,
so can we safely
right.
say if you want a bigger neck, you should do neck exercises, and if you want a big upper
I
back, you should
think
do upper
that's the
back
like, yeah,
exercises?
that's the
Yeah,
agreement. If you want a
I
bigger
think
neck,
that's fair. Right. Yeah, I think that
and if
I
you
think
want to
that's
train
fair.
the upper traps, if you want to train the upper traps, my suggestion is to use a horizontal shrugging motion,
Hmm.
which I'm gonna. Here's my thing. I think they're gonna the posterior translation, um, like component is gonna get trained really well in just rows. Like you
It
just do a
is.
row, like it's gonna
Yeah.
pull the clavicle posterior. And I think the upper trap fibers are also going to get trained very well in something like a Y raise or just laterals and things like that as you get the arm more overhead and it shortens more and has to pull the clavicle more medial and posterior in those particular motions. I think even something like the reverse pec deck, which people think are rear delts, is not also not a bad motion either for the upper traps because it also pulls the clavicle posterior in those motions.
I don't
So
think it
I
loads
don't.
it enough though. I mean, it does the motion, but not like when you have a long lever there. You're not putting like it would be a very very minimal load on the posterior
It's
translation
gonna be.
component.
It'll be split across upper, mid, and rhomboid.
Yeah, but
But
they won't be even remotely challenged compared to the posterior delt with fatigue way before
the
you get to
post
effective
delt,
reps in the upper back. Yeah,
there's that's a the pec the reverse pec deck is the seated abduction for the shoulder joint.
yeah, yeah. So
There's a lot.
all
Okay.
right. Well,
Um,
you think people should bias more the posterior translation. I think that you look at your program and you need to have medial rotation and posterior translation there. I think you would at least agree with that, and
I
that's what
think
you're
that
doing with the other
here's what I
exercises, right?
just said. I think medial rotation happens as a byproduct of other motions.
Yeah, and you think posterior translation happens also as a byproduct of other motions like rows, right? So
Yeah,
so
totally.
most people don't need to do direct trap training, period.
Wow, did we end up in an agreement by the end?
Yeah. Well, I figured we
I think
could,
if you're
right?
doing, I think when people talk about getting big traps, let's see if we can find a point of agreement and an exit on that. I think when people talk about getting big traps and they want big traps, like to look yoked, what they're actually
Mhm.
talking about is mid traps, those C7, and they mistake those as upper trap fibers. And I think if you want big traps, get strong on your rowing motions, especially something where you're looking at a 90-degree of abduction angle, right? Where you're coming straight back like this right here, and you
Mhm.
have good scapular abduction, and then you also have the posterior translation of the clavicle. And then if you're doing stuff like Y raises or you're doing a Lou raise and that kind of stuff, those are good trap motions too. Like this whole idea of like, hey, what's best for upper traps? I'm like they're not. It's not a huge division of fibers,
Mhm.
and they're going to get trained in medial rotation and posterior translation of the clavicle as a default motion, because the
So
scapular it's accommodating those scapular motions. The thing is like in either one of them, you don't have isolated movements of the scapula without the clavicle and the clavicle without the scapula, right? They move in conjunction, and that's
you
why all
can't
the
raise one without the other. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
exactly.
So here's a question. If you say that the levator is like what drives the shrug or whatnot, right? So should I just do shrug so that I can get a jacked as fuck levator? Because that'll push out on my upper traps like a big brachialis pushes out on a bicep. So would shrugging
I
motion still lead to the desired physique change, but via big levators instead of instead of bigger, upper traps?
So
Can I
I
just get a
actually tried
yoked
to
levator?
find like what's yeah, I mean like clearly you can hypertrophy the levators. I mean they're just a muscle just like anything else. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't they're actual they seem to be it's kind of like hypertrophying the spinae rectors, right? Like they're not like actually as thick and dense as people like think they are, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not like these massively like thick. People always think that because how they look like cosmetic, but
Well, I
they're
mean, I think it depends on like when you get into the body's building sphere, you just see some shit that doesn't fit the physiological norms that we would have on,
well, I
muscle
mean,
volume
there's
data, right?
always going to be that. What I'm
Right.
saying is comparatively, yeah, you could if you're doing shrugs, you're going to build your levator, and will it kind of like you said with the brachialis pushes the bicep and tricep apart, right? So it gives you kind of that thicker looking arm.
Mhm.
So if you build a levator, is it going to give you kind of a thicker looking upper back? Absolutely.
Yeah. So if that's what you're going for, if you want more of this, right? And we could, you
But
think that there'd
that's
be a decent
probably
amount of,
also, here's the thing. That's probably also the other misconception that could potentially happen there cosmetically is that if the levator thickens up and pushes those upper traps up there out just a little bit, then people will be like, well, I did shrugs and my upper traps got thicker. I'm like, maybe it's just the
yeah.
levator that's getting thicker and pushing those out more.
So, like, because what I'm asking is that even if we disagree on the amount of upper trap involvement in a shrug, what you're saying is that the aesthetic outcome could still be that shrugs could make that area look bigger. So in
100%.
essence, then, shrugs could give you faux upper traps by your logic, right?
It would make like that upper trap region. It looks like they're thicker, but it from
Yeah,
a
that's why I said
technicality standpoint,
faux upper traps, right?
right? So
So
you would, yeah, essentially you would have thicker, yeah, thicker under upper traps, right?
yeah.
So
Mhm.
like if the levator thickens, which will happen in the shrug, right? Like they're going to grow. They would essentially yes, because they're a deep muscle, they're going to push out whatever over the top of them more.
Mhm.
So I do think that is could be a cosmetic misconception that does happen sometimes. Because I think the one part that we do 100% agree on is like the upper traps don't have like a ton of potential for like massive hypertrophy. Like
So
they're just
so so if the upper traps don't have a potential for hypertrophy, and they don't shrug, but levator shrugs and they can hypertrophy, then shrugs would be better for aesthetically improving the upper traps because you do that, right? Like, I mean, I'm taking
no,
your thing to a little
I would
absurd,
agree.
but right?
Right, like cosmetically, aesthetically, if that was an area, like, but that's what you do with like a bicep, tricep, brachialis. That's a great example.
Yeah.
Is that if you grow the brachialis, right, and you get an actual quote unquote thicker looking arm, makes your arm from the side look like it's bigger simply because it's going to push the bicep and tricep out
Yeah.
from one another. So from a cosmetic appearance, but again, I think that's a great point. I think sometimes why people think, oh, I did shrugs, my upper traps grew, that's why.
Yeah. I would argue that I just think shrugs are going to grow the levator and the upper traps both, and to whatever their different potentials based off of your structure, your genetics, and what other exercises that you're including, how much upward rotation and
And
laterals
I,
and all of
again,
that
that's
stuff
nothing I
together,
ever said
you know?
was that a shrug won't grow the upper traps at all, but the potential for their hypertrophy is just relatively much smaller.
Yes. Well, if you came out and said it like that, then we wouldn't be having this discussion, like, at all.
But
Um,
that was always
but
my
that's fine.
point. But that was
So.
always my point. Like, is like if you're going to do a shrug, what you're really going to grow, right, is levator and mid traps.
Yeah, and I think that's our point of like contention. Is I think if you do a shrug, you're going to grow levator and upper traps, and I think if you do the Kelso shrug, that you would be biasing more middle traps than upper traps relative to doing the shrug. That's where our thing is I think
I,
that
and
I
I
think
think
I
this
think shrugs are going to do both, but I think it functions on a continuum where this is like as we go from like a vertical motion, whether it be here or here, as we start to move from here to more back, that it becomes more middle trap biased, especially like per what we found is that at about 60 degrees it really went to where those middle trap fibers were more, right? And as you start to get to more horizontal, then even the lower traps start to come in more. And then if you start going up here, then it's almost all exclusively. So it's like it's a to me, it looks like it's a continuum from, you know, more upper trap bias to more middle trap bias to more lower trap bias. And the levator is always going to be a component of anything that's elevating the scapula, as is the serratus anterior, as is the rhomboids, but the participation is going to be dependent on how much upward rotation is happening, how much retraction is happening in the respective movement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Okay. Well, then, yeah. So then I don't know where we're in disagreement then, because I mean, on that aspect, right? I know, because that's why I'm like, well, okay, if you do, like, I just think that, you know, if we look at it in a vacuum, not including the, you know, all the other exercises that you're doing, that I think a vertical motion is going to be a little bit more like, especially, you know, if you want to include the posterior translation, it would be something like 70-ish degrees, right? Like a shrug of like, you know, like a very slight prone incline, right? To me, that would be
You
like
could
the
do a
most.
shrug. Here's the thing: you could do a shrug, but it'd be like what are those called? Monkey shrugs. You remember those?
Monkey shrugs. Are you talking about like just where you're like you're doing some abduction? Oh, that right? Okay. Now this is the levator exercise, by the way. Is this
Right.
retraction shrug like this?
Well, the
That
reason,
is the
yeah.
levator
Once
exercise.
once you get into that upwards rotation though, and then you're not getting any more force production out of those, like in that upwards rotation that you have that minimal amount, then you'll get more upper traps. And I'd
So
have to go back and look at, there's another study that looks at that. So it's like 30 degrees of abduction. So once you get to like 30, like, and you have more elevation that's occurring, there's
yeah,
even
so
more.
if you shrug like this in abduction, then it's more traps, less levator.
Yep. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, if you do that, right? That's why like lateral raises are, you know, in any like even your favorite guy, Dr. Mike, like his super ROM
The
laterals, like,
bust.
you know, it's like
No, no
it's a
angel
great,
flies. No
it's a
angel
great,
abduction.
yeah, or Lou raises or whatever you want to call them. Like, yeah, there's
I
going to be
mean,
a lot of
the
upper
Lou raise
trap and middle
is a
trap there.
great, the Lou raise is a great trap exercise for that reason, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I like to be done with cables.
yeah. Well, I mean, I would say both are feasible because they both have limitations in your ability to load different portions of the range and
Of the
whatnot,
rhomb,
right?
right?
You know,
Yep.
you just
Of
like
yeah, the joint.
yeah, what we really need is a machine. Like what we really need is a lateral raise machine that works in the scapular plane. You know, honk honk,
Right.
wink wink to anybody watching.
Okay. So I think like our source of contention is simply going to be the percentage that's happening between upper traps and mid traps in a vertical stroke.
Mhm.
I agree the upper traps will grow some in vertical shrug. I think the biggest thing is if you want to grow upper traps, that a horizontal shrug is probably a better choice just because that's the orientation of the fibers. And I think they have a better line of pull in that position.
Yep.
So I
Okay.
think that you do still need to train medial rotation.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to find the areas we agree on. You need to train
Yeah.
medial rotation. I think that gets trained as a byproduct of the motions that happen between like the scapula and humerus, right? So anytime like you're bringing this motion and you're doing this motion and you're doing this motion right here, you're getting some sense of medial rotation at the clavicle. So you're training that component function that loads those does load those upper trap fibers. It has to
Mhm.
pull, right? And
Yep.
my thing is that a vertical shrug is being driven by the levator, and then it's going to be the levator, it's going to be mid traps, and it's going to be rhomboids. Doesn't mean there's no upper traps, which I never said.
Yeah.
I've tried to not. I try to get away from saying no anything. Like being contrarian is fun, but like it's also not accurate. And so I've tried to get away from like ever saying like no because there's almost nothing that's a no. Like
Yeah, and I
absolute
had to
sentiment.
argue that I had to argue on your like with Brett about that statement that you made
Don't
on the
you have?
glutes for like an hour and a half.
I could. You have used no lots of times in the past before. So
Yes, we both
like that's
we have both used humor and satire in
yes, we
our
both
fucking
use no,
content, right?
and it's not because it's just because that times being contrarian can be fun and create engagement
Mhm.
with, but at the same time you end up having to clarify that later, and then even worse is that people end up repeating that and getting into arguments on your behalf And you're like, well, let me be more exact. It's like when I say no, it means that it's not, that's not a good movement for that particular. And
Hmm.
that's has always been my thing about shrugs is like if we're looking at a shrug, I think the biggest thing is like I said, most people consistently what they get wrong is that the vertical shrug is upper traps. I think what they're thinking of as upper traps is actually mid traps, C7 stuff. Like
Hmm.
that's your big, thick, meaty trap part. And
Yeah.
then I think if you, we can, it's okay for us to disagree. Like I wouldn't use a vertical shrug to train upper traps. Yeah, I would do the horizontal shrug. And then I would just let my other motions that go through higher degrees of humeral elevation train that medial clavicle rotation component.
Yeah. Um, even um, if I'm trying to remember, like, so on from a sarcomere length perspective, the traps were on the
Mid range,
somewhat on,
mid range,
they were
mid
mid-range to
range.
slight descending, right? Something like that.
I don't think they're on the descending realm.
I yeah, okay. I couldn't remember. Um, that's a
I don't think that
conversation, the whole sarcomere length thing, and I'll how that functions. That's a conversation for the other day. But in terms of challenging the upper traps in a more lengthened position, you would need to be in the most clavicular, we'll say, downward rotation position that you could possibly be. And I would say that might be if you're not doing anything like heavy, where you heavy carry, whether it's a trap bar deadlift or anything like that. Like that could be a component that you might be missing. So that's what I usually tell people is like it's only worth adding shrugs if you're not actually loading that part of the movement. Because if all you're
that's
doing is like
why like if
upward, like laterals and high raises, it's like
that's
you might
why
be getting volume, but it's all on the short, just the short side.
yeah, then that's why I say for a shrug, if you're going to do a shrug, using a little bit of hip flexion to where you're actually kind of bent more a little bit so that it's more of like a combination of
Yeah,
like
but about
retraction.
70 degrees is where I think it would be optimal. You probably think,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're saying a Kelso shrug, you might say more, but I really like,
No.
no.
I'm saying if you're doing a standing shrug, not as
Hmm.
Kelso. Like if you're doing a standing shrug, if you could just add in a little bit of hip flexion
Yeah.
there, so that way you're just
Yeah.
not pulling this motion like you said, and you can still load a little bit of
Yeah.
this. It's you get a
Yeah.
little bit of protraction plus
Yeah.
depression.
Even the vertical shrug example you did in your video, like you're actually like hunched and leaned over to where your
A little
spine
bit.
is at about 70 degrees, right? Like so it's you're instinctively finding that area where you have better mechanical
You
leverage, right?
do like where you have that leverage, right? Because you exactly. So I mean, that's like I'm just saying if you just lean a little bit
Hmm.
like that and get like a split instead of trying to say like directly vertical.
Hmm.
Like if
Yeah.
you'll lean a little bit, it's more of a natural motion, and then there's a little bit more of an adduction component that happens at the scapula, which like
Yeah.
is closer to that. So
Okay. So would you agree
that's
with this then? Because if I was going to say, okay, you want to train the upper traps through their full range of motion and you want to do it specifically with shrugs and all of your exercises, I would be like, all right, well, you're going to do an overhead shrug in a near vertical position, right? Where you basically the posterior translation just has to happen there for the top. And I would say
I
that
would
what you just said at the bottom for a 70-degree like ish prone
I would
or
I
slightly
wouldn't
lean
use
forward.
I wouldn't use like an overhead shrug like that. Number one, I think that your capacity for loading is going to be relatively low, and the need for stability is relatively high. So I'd like in terms of training upper traps, that would be a motion I'd use.
I agree with you that there's a stability in a loading challenge, but if I'm saying that, like, well, how do we really shorten it? That's what I do. And it's if you use a cable instead of like a dumbbell, the stability is much easier to manage. And I wouldn't say the stability challenge is
If you were
greater
gonna
than doing
train
a Lou raise or a Y raise or any of those things.
if you were wanting to, the way you would mitigate that was to use like a vertical incline bench and a Smith machine to do it. That would actually reduce. You could load it better, and then you would have more better stability. So rather than if you do like a standing barbell,
So
like
you
overhead,
you do a Smith shrug.
right, like an overhead Smith machine shrug.
Yeah, something like that. Or even if you just had a shoulder press
Because if you did
machine
an overhead
that you
shrug
could
and
get
then
in
the
the right
Smith
position,
machine,
right?
right? If that's going to say if that's what you wanted to train in that super short position, then using the Smith machine for an overhead shrug would give you better
Yeah.
stability and you
Hmm.
actually offer a better loading.
Yeah. Probably be better if you could do it in a shoulder press where you could be in a more neutral like rotation than being pure pronated, probably being it because this way you could like be kind of in coming back in from a scapular plane position rather than, the pronation kind of pulling
If
you
you
into
had
internal
stuff, you,
rotation.
you could do it. Yeah, you could do it in if you had a converging shoulder press machine
Yeah.
with
So, or
with this,
it wouldn't even have to be converged. It would just have to be like narrow enough, even if it
just
like,
something
right.
that you could get in this position
Mhm.
here and then load from here. Yeah,
Yep.
right
Yep.
there.
So it would be
Yeah,
that
that would
motion,
be.
and like regardless of how you do it, it would be that motion, and then the equivalent of a lean forward, shrug motion. That would be my like, all right, there's your shortened, lengthened upper trap if you wanted to train it with shrug motions.
For the lengthen, just I would just go with emphasizing protraction in the row.
Yeah. So that's where we slightly disagree. Is I think it should be a hybrid, not just a row, but like it's got to be a load. If we're focusing on upper traps, I think if we go to a row, we're gonna like the upper traps aren't going to contribute as much. The middle traps are just going to dominate the movement too much.
If we're
The
talking,
middle
no, I was
traps
just
and
talking traps
rhomboids.
in general.
Yeah,
I was
no,
just talking
I'm
traps
saying
and
specific
rhomboids.
to upper traps, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
specific to upper traps, training them in a lengthened position. It, yeah, like
the exercise you were just talking about, the slight lean forward, that's shrug. Like that's what I would use.
yeah, but that's how I just do shrugs anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
So because there's a retraction component. There's more
Yeah.
of a retraction rather than straight scapular elevation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're only leaned forward slightly, it's still more vertical than posterior bias, right?
Right. But the point of having a little bit of lean is to reduce some of
Yes.
the levator scapula involvement.
So I don't think it would reduce the levator scapula fold. I just think it lines up better with the upper trap fibers. I think if anything, it's actually going to be more levator scapula involvement there, right? Because the more retraction you get, the more the levators are going to be advantaged, right? But I don't think that takes away from the fact that it's a good upper trap exercise. I think something
Well,
can be
no,
a
that's what I
good
mean. If
good
you're
for
lining
both
if
the upper
with
traps
the
and the
lean, you're
levator at the
lining
same time.
with the lean, you're lining it up. The humerus gets lined up better with the orientation of those mid trap fibers.
Yes. But the
Yes.
scapula also gets orientated better with the levator pull as well.
Yeah,
and
it's got
and
a
and
better.
and, and, and the rhomboid minor as well, right? Did you know that the rhomboid minor and the levator are actually cinched together with connective tissue? They're united at like
Right.
so they can innervatedly function differently, but they can't really one pulls on the other,
Yeah,
right?
I mean that's why I end up doing the shrugs in that fashion. It's like I think
Yeah,
it's a better
yeah,
to have some lean
yeah,
is better in that way. So,
yeah. But I
but
think it's
I like I said, I don't even if I get asked if I'm going to train the upper traps, if that's what you want to do. I would still go with the horizontal shrug. But again, I think any motions that are taking you into higher degrees of humor elevation to get them even shorter potentially could be better. But it's just not something I worry about. I think when people think about upper traps, they're thinking about those C7 mid trap fibers.
yeah. I mean that's fair, but I mean when we're talking about the specifics of this, I think we have to talk about reality, right? Not people's delusions. So
But I
I
think
think
that's
we
where the
agree on most
confusion comes
things,
in.
right? So
Yeah,
I
I think
think
the
if we
confusion
wrap up
comes in.
with our points of agreement are, you know, we both think that there's limitations in terms of how much absolute hypertrophy that you can get in the higher fibers of the upper traps, right? Your neck's not gonna fucking grow wider than your shoulders or anything like that, right?
Right.
The majority of your hypertrophy potential is the lowest portion of the upper trap and the highest portion of the middle trap, right? It's like that area
Which is,
right
yes.
right above your fucking scapulus,
What
right?
people think of as this right here is actually, yeah, there's a very small
Yeah.
area, very small area
Hmm.
that comes over and attaches right here.
Yep.
So
So,
that's about the clavicle,
okay.
right? So
All
it comes
right.
down over here and attaches over the clavicle.
Okay. We agree that levators work in shrugs, and we also agree that hypertrophying that might then affect the overall aesthetic goal that people are probably going for when they're shrugging, right?
I think that's probably what
Yeah,
happens.
that's I think that's fair. Um, I think we can both agree that the collective EMG data that we have is lacking at best in terms of regarding the upper traps.
I think the Castellan's a great study. I think it would have been a better study if they would have done a better job with placement on the upper, mid, and lower traps.
Yeah, well, but what I'm saying
That
is that we
that's
can't.
a study done that way where you have surface level combined with fine wire where we can look at the deep muscles comparatively, but then have C6, C7, and then everything below that
Yeah.
measured out equally as well. So
I
they
mean,
did a
if we're
great job in
following
looking at.
that, they should have also measured the levator, or not. They should also have measured the serratus, right, as well,
Yes, that would have been
right?
fantastic.
So
Yeah, they
right, so
measured the
it's it.
serratus. That would have been
Yeah.
fantastic.
So I mean,
That's what we don't
there's
have. Like we
nothing
don't have.
complete. Nothing is
No,
complete,
like
and
that would
nothing is accurate.
if they had measured serratus in conjunction with that, that would have been an amazing study. So that's how one needs to be done, but with better sensor placement and looking at the anterior serratus, because
Okay.
that gives us a more complete picture.
All right, and we're not looking at this as, we're not disagreeing as like apples and oranges. We're like disagreeing between like Red Delicious and Granny Smith when it comes to our view on shrugs, right? Is that you still think that, you know, shrugs could go upper traps, right? But they're mainly driven by the levator, and mid traps. I think
I
that
would
it's
just
more going to
define a
be,
vertical shrug as a levator and mid trap exercise. That's
yeah.
was just my
And I
point.
would
I
I
don't.
would define it as the levator and upper trap exercise. Right. That's where we differ, right? But you would
Right.
say that it would be the highest portion of the middle trap, right? That would, like, the C7 would be the most
Yeah,
dominant,
the
and I would
C7,
right, and that's where
because there's
hypertrophy the most.
the other studies that have looked at vertical shrugs, they always use the C7 and it's very high.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So there's no doubt there. I'm saying the fibers that are directly adjacent to that, which are the upper trap,
Right.
right,
They
are
just have a
also going to
different
be,
function.
yeah.
Right. They just have a different function. Right.
I mean,
So, I mean, that,
they're so, like, I mean, those fibers are almost parallel to each other. Their functions are very, very similar. It's only when you start going really high on the upper trap that you really see the function start to deviate. But the fibers at C6 and fibers at C7, are doing like they're like 98% of the
really
same
very
function, right?
C, yeah, C6 and C7. But you know what would actually eliminate the confusion is if they combine C6 and C7 to mid trap and then everything above C6 to upper trap.
Well, it's so this is where it's, and so the Johnson study did the segments based off of the origin, right? But I've also seen studies that divvy up the traps based off of the insertion, right? And then I've also seen looking at functional divisions of the traps based off of like a EMG, right? And stuff like that. And then you got to take and be like, all right, what's the overall with that? So at C6, we were looking at like, well, okay, those fibers are now part of the nuchal ligament, and so they're sharing a commonality in origin with all of the other fibers that attach into the nuchal ligament, right? And so it's like, well, okay, is that what we qualify, as now these are being structurally different, and that's where the division is, right? Because we talked about this, and this is correlated in a couple of the functional studies of the traps, is that it appears that the fibers for the superior nuchal line, right, are able to be recruited differently, right? So that, like, okay, for the upper traps, there's at least two functional divisions. There's the ones that attach to the head.
There's multiple
Yeah,
subdivisions
yeah,
of the divisions of the traps.
yeah,
And
yeah,
they're like
right.
each subdivision is controlled independently by the nervous system. So they're like even within the upper traps, there's different subdivisions of the upper traps that
Yeah,
do different components.
yeah. So I think it's fair to say that it's, in terms of shrugs, you're more biased towards the nuchal ligament, especially the lower half, right? But we don't know for sure. That's where it's just like, all right, you only have the EMG studies looking at where that separation is, and this is the hard thing with our research of, like, when you're looking at subdivisions of subdivisions, and then you're trying to figure out, well, is that a different subdivision, or is in some people it separates out into a fourth bicep head or whatever the hell it is. It's like, well, it's a clear subdivision there because the muscle has a structural separation, and then others it doesn't. And you
I
have all
think
this
that's also why in
going on.
looking at especially the traps, because they're so close, but yet they have different origins and insertion
Mm-hmm.
points, that it can be harder. And that's why
Yeah,
to differentiate some of that activation or action
yeah,
potentials that are going on there because they are so close. But and yet while the C6 and C7, once you get into scapular
mm-hmm.
elevation, are going to have some similar functions,
Mm-hmm.
they're also going to have, like you said, there's going to be some different things that happen once you get into different joint ranges of motion and elevation and things like that.
Yeah,
So we have to balance that out um, by being able to actually differentiate what's going on there from an activation
mm-hmm.
standpoint between those two different divisions. And yes, within those, like, I don't know how we've done that with the delts where we can look at different subdivisions, and we actually see that showing up if you know how to look at them in different EMG studies, which is like internal, external rotation, neutral shoulder position, and stuff like that. Abduction shows different degrees of activations across anterior, middle, and posterior, because those different subdivisions within the deltoid, like, they're governed differently by the nervous system as you go through those joint ranges of motion. So um, it can be like a splitting hairs thing, but that's why I said, well, I'm consistently just saying that from a motion standpoint, like, what's really driving that motion through the majority of the joint range of motion. And then that's okay. This is a good exercise for that. Doesn't mean that other things are not. There's always going to be something else involved. And then so how I think that I look at bias is like, what is something dominating that motion? Is something have the greatest amount of leverage in that motion? And like I said, I always try to come back and look at, if we understand the leverages at those joint ranges of motion, and then activation, EMG studies line up with that. That's usually pretty good backing each other up within those particular things. And we have that for a multitude of things. Like, with the traps, it's harder because we have so many deep muscles involved that are doing stuff, and we can't always get to those without the fine wire stuff. So, all right, I have to go. I haven't even done cardio today.
All right, man.
Okay.
Well, enjoy your cardio. Thank you for coming on and suffering through this.
It was fine. It ended up being a decent discussion by the end, as you.
I knew it would eventually get there if we could just get through the shit.
I think what people don't understand, which used to piss me off something fierce, is like when people would say something like, "Paul just repeats Cass." I'm like, we argue on almost everything to some degree. Like, we agree on a lot of stuff and we disagree on a lot of stuff, and then most of the stuff that we disagree on can be nuanced.
Yeah.
So, and this would be at the end of the day, if you do a vertical shrug, are you going to grow traps? Yes. Like,
yeah. I mean, my main contention was, like, it wasn't a complete absolute statement, but it was, I mean, it was borderline, right? And that's where, like, I was like, well, no, of course, like, if you shrug, you're going to work your upper traps. And so, because the starting point was so divergent, I think
it's
that's
kind of
what
like
kind of led
saying,
to it, right?
if you do a hammer curl, if somebody says it's not a bicep exercise, I would agree with that. It's a brachialis exercise, right? Like, that doesn't mean the biceps are doing nothing.
Actually, on EMG, fucking the biceps do more on hammer curls. Like, have fun explaining that shit, right?
I don't know if you've seen the recent one. There's a really bad study that came out. This is a completely different topic. Sometimes EMG just totally shits the bed. And there's one that came out recently that was, did you see it? Was the RDL stiff leg deadlift, and then deficit RDLs. The whole study is just trash. Makes no sense.
Yeah. That's why, like, I'm very limited on, like, when, you're like, oh, you don't like state or whatever. I'm like, when I view EMG as a good tool when it's done properly, but it can be also completely worthless in a different context, right?
100%. That's why that's why you have to understand, when you're looking at one, depending on the outcomes, the methodologies that the people use and how they implemented it, and a multitude of other things, they can be horrible. They can be absolutely horrible and lead people down the wrong path altogether.
Yeah, but the same thing can be true for pretty much everything, right? Even mechanical modeling, where somebody's like, "Oh, this has a moment arm here," and then forgetting that it also has a moment arm in another direction and whatever, and then they're assuming that, like, oh, well, that's its function. I'm like, well,
that's just why it's very important to do your due diligence and understanding how most of the stuff works to a good degree, and then being able to understand. I mean, the one thing, like, we talked about, like, even earlier, things like, if we're looking at activation, that's one thing. But then, for example, like the seat abduction machine, that's a great point. Is like, yeah, I think piriformis activation would be off the chart. I think it would be way up there. But then we have to measure, like, what else is going on here in this motion. Like,
doesn't mean it's producing more total force than the posterior fibers of the glute med, right?
Right. But it's definitely producing more than the lower fibers.
I mean, what you're doing. I mean, this is where I think, like, if we can drive this message home, right, is that when it comes to hypertrophy, like, and this is where, when you're like, well, what's driving the motion? I'm like, I kind of want to reel it back, is that it's not about how much force a muscle is producing in the movement. It's about how challenging it is for that muscle to produce that force, right? Because it's about the mechanical tension relative to the muscle, not how much force that mechanical tension results in, right? So even so, in the case like, well, if the piriformis is working its little fucking ass off, at the fucking fiber level, well, then it's going to get more stimulus than a larger muscle that may be producing force, but it's not
Which
actually
is
working
why
at a
we
stimulatory
qualify
level.
that, which is why we qualify that as a good exercise for the piriformis.
Yeah, and that's kind of my same logic here with the upper traps, is that like, well, in that motion, like they're still working substantially hard, even if we look at the map, where we disagree is on how much force they can produce. But I would say, well, even if your view is that the levator is producing more of the force, I'm still saying, yeah, but are those upper trap fibers actually producing for them the mechanical tension that they would need for the stimulus, even if they aren't, like, because they're working as hard as they can to shrug, right? We have a different opinion on the relationship there,
You
but
know,
I
the thing I
think
didn't
we're
even
both.
think, like the other part about that would also be loading on shrug and range of motion on a
Mhm.
shrug.
Yeah.
So if you were a heavily loaded shrug with what you've seen people do, like shrugs where they basically barely get their shoulders elevated, right? Well,
Mhm.
the clavicle's not going to be moving a whole lot. So, and then if you had a lighter loaded shrug, vertical shrug, where you can really stick your ears into your or your shoulders into your ears, you're going to get more medial rotation of the clavicle. So
Mhm.
execution matters too.
Yeah, execution matters, loading. And I think actually, when it comes to that, it's like there may be application for both of those things, right? I mean, we know now that, like, if we have a complementary motion, then doing a heavy partial and a different thing may be complementary, right? Like, so it might be like, hey, if you're doing a bunch of stuff that's in the top half of, medial rotation, then maybe the heavy partial shrug is actually better than doing a lighter shrug with more rotation, so that you actually really overload that portion of the movement, right?
Right? Yeah, these
So,
are, like I said, these are very super nuanced conversations. I think um, we could go on all day about that. So
yeah.
anyway,
All
it
right. Well,
ultimately
we'll
ended
do
up
this
being good.
again in better
Well,
context
have
next
they
time,
come back
right?
and we'll argue about like sarcomere lengths and like
Yeah, that'll be a
measurements that
good
we
one.
do now and stuff like that for
I
like
know people would like that.
longitudinal hypertrophy studies that look at that stuff. Like the triceps one, I've had to address a multitude of times. Like the fact is that nobody else that I know of that's smart, and that's, I'll put you in the category of people that I know that are smart, won't address that study. The people I know that just keep repeating that those are longer muscle length outcomes, it's absolutely BS. And the fact that the evidence biased community keeps repeating that when that's not correct drives me
Yeah.
nuts, because I have to deal with that weekly.
Yeah, I mean, I have. We'll just put it this way. I just go with like, hmm. I will shrug in response to the results of that study. Right. That's what I. This is my response to that. It's
Right.
like, yeah,
Right.
it's to
Yes. I'm
me,
gonna
it's
work
like,
my elevators.
I
I'm
don't
gonna
like,
work my elevator
it's
scapula
unexplained.
on that one. Yes. Like the smart people I know that work in this field haven't actually addressed those studies because they know it's those outcomes are BS. So that would be another one that we could touch on sometimes, actually dealing with this outpouring right now of saying that muscles benefit from longer lengths, which just at a like
Yeah.
face value is not an accurate statement.
All right.
So
I would like to have that discussion, because I'm actually going to try and have some discussion with people on multiple ends of the spectrum on that. And so it would be great for
and
you, because I know you and
definitely when they
Chris
benefit.
are the furthest into using the sarcomere length model. So it would be great to have you, or you guys comment on that.
Yeah, like just line up the ones that you want to cover and we'll do it again.
All right, man. Have a good one.
Okay,
Enjoy your
bud.
cardio.
Have a
Bye.
good day.